Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our first virtual event. I'm Laura Champion, Director of the Structural Engineering Institute at ASCE, and I'm joining you today from my home office in Reston, Virginia. This special virtual event highlights content from Structures Congress 2020 that was planned for this week in St. Louis. Thank you to all the members, presenters, exhibitors, sponsors, and staff who were involved in planning for the St. Louis in-person Congress. Just 3.5 weeks ago, when we canceled the Congress, we never would have envisioned how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed our lives and the lives around the world today. The SEI leadership, Board of Governors, and ASCE and the SEI staff hope that you and your family are staying healthy during these unprecedented times. Today's event is a snapshot of the 2020 Structures Congress content that we want to share with you. This is an event for the civil and structural engineering community. We are recording this event, and it will be available to everyone to view afterwards. We are pleased that you have joined us today and look for future SEI and ASCE online opportunities. Please participate in the live chat with any questions or virtually network with your peers and the SEI staff. Now, I would like to introduce SEI President Glenn Bell, who will be today's MC and will start our program. Glenn retired recently from Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager after 45 years, of which 22 years was as CEO, to devote himself full-time to professional service. He is co-director of the Cross U.S. program, board member of the Charles Pankow Foundation, external assessment panel member for the Center for Risk-Based Community Resilience Planning at Colorado State University, and the Gatley Dixon Visiting Scholar at the University of Bath in the UK. Please welcome Glenn.
Thank you, Laura. Over 1,400 have registered for today's event. Hundreds of you are from over 60 countries outside the US. Welcome. This is just amazing. As structural engineers, we often deal with societal crises resulting from natural disasters, but the scope and nature of today's societal challenge is unprecedented in our lifetimes. Our profession's commitment to the health, safety, and welfare of the public has never been more relevant. In the days and weeks ahead, we should reflect on the specific meaning of those three words: health, safety, and welfare. Following the cancellation of the in-person Congress, we felt it was important that we carry on in some manner, as difficult as it's been. Over the last 3.5 weeks, SEI staff have done a phenomenal job shifting gears from our usual in-person Congress format to the virtual event we'll enjoy today. I'd like also to thank the many member volunteers, technical and local planning committees, sponsors, exhibitors, partnering and cooperating organizations, and staff for their efforts in planning the on-site events scheduled for Structures Congress 2020. In addition to this virtual Congress, in the weeks ahead, we'll announce ways to make available more content and opportunities to connect remotely. So here's what's in store today. First, Sarah Sladek will deliver her keynote, Generations at Work, How to Make the Most of Multi-Generational Teams. Following Sarah's presentation, we'll have 10 minutes of live chat Q&A. Submit questions at any time during and after the presentation via the chat box on your screen. Then we'll have a short break before our second presentation on developments with Cross US, confidential reporting on structural safety in the United States, with myself, Alistair Sohn, and Andy Herman. This again will be followed by Q&A from our viewers, and then we'll have another short break. The final presentation is Performance-Based Design is the Future with Don Dusenberry. Don chairs the SEI committee that is developing a path to advance the profession from prescriptive to performance-based design practice. After his presentation, we'll have a final round of Q&A. Thank you to our Structures Congress sponsors, our partnering organization, the Institution of Structural Engineers United Kingdom, and cooperating organizations. I'm now pleased to introduce Sarah Sladek. Sarah is a best-selling author, speaker, and CEO. Since 2002, her life's work has been helping organizations engage future generations of talent. A leading researcher of generational insights, Sarah has authored several books and research papers on generational topics. Her book, Talent Generation, identifies the core strategies essential to engaging today's talent. Sarah has been featured prominently in international trade media, and she's keynoted events worldwide. With years of experience and supported by solid research, Sarah is committed to helping organizations engage every generation to thrive and prosper in the new economy. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Sladek. Welcome to the 2020 Structures Congress. This is Generations at Work. I'd like to start by welcoming you to the end of work as we know it. As ominous as that might sound, we know that we are indeed at the end of an era for a few key reasons. Yes, we're experiencing a global pandemic right now, and yes, you might be sitting there in your pajamas wishing that you were in St. Louis. All big concerns to indicate that we're experiencing the end or at least a major change in something. But that's not what I'm referring to. We've actually been experiencing this path, this journey towards the end of work as we know it for quite some time. We know we're at the end of an era for a few key reasons. The first one being the economy. Ever since the dot-com bubble burst in the year 2000, we have experienced a global, unstable, unpredictable economy, extreme highs, extreme lows. That's changed the values and perceptions of a generation that's come of age during this time of incredible disruption. It influences our values and our workplaces. The other reason that we know we're at the end of an era is technology. Really rapidly changing, unprecedented developments in technology. We've seen more technology developed in the past few years than in the past 50. We never really stopped to think about that, but that's changing everything about the way we live, work, and do business. And it certainly has changed our workplaces and our expectations of different generations, especially those who have been raised during this era of rapid change, instant gratification, and so much more. The third reason that we know we're at the end of work as we know it is the demographic shift. So here again, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but the baby boomers were the majority of the workforce for 34 years. Over 3 decades of the same management styles and values and principles were in place. Many of our organizations are still largely run by baby boomers. However, at the end of 2015, boomers ceded the majority of the workforce to the millennial generation, a very young generation. And for the first time in a really long time, our workforce is now getting younger instead of older. This is on the verge of ushering in so much change. One thing is certain, change is inevitable. We are definitely experiencing the end of an era. We especially know this in your industry. As I was preparing for my talk today, I did some surveys and interviews with some of your leaders, and here are some of the comments I received in return. Our industry needs to reboot, not remain in the 1850 mindset. The world is changing. We need to change as leaders to keep up. Otherwise, we're going to be completely automated. Or how about this one? We need to be focused on emerging leaders, teaching them leadership skills, negotiation, communication, other critical skills, because our future leaders are going to have to be able to do things like be creative, communicate ideas, care for others. It's not going to be just leading in terms of calculations and mathematics anymore. They're going to have to do the things that computers simply can't do. Or how about this one? Our industry's concerned about retirements, definitely, with that baby boomer retirement wave. And now we have to get young people into the field, and that's been more difficult than was expected. So we all must be mindful of the future. We've got to work together. We have to learn from one another. I think these are excellent insights as to the state of the industry right now, the state of the workforce right now. We are definitely at that end of work as we know it, but we're at the beginning of something new and different. Our organizations are either going to see this as a great challenge or a great opportunity, depending on how the leaders like you choose to approach this situation. But before we go forward, we have to go backward. We have to go back and look at some of the changes and fully understand this generational shift, this demographic shift that's occurred. Because when we look at generations and we study the changes that are occurring, we know that generations are heavily influenced by what happens in their childhood and adolescent years. In other words, what's happening right now with the global pandemic, we know that's really going to influence Gen Z as well as the generation to follow them, because most Gen Zs are currently in childhood and adolescence. So let's take a brief tour through history and really understand how the heck did we get here? How have those values shifted? How have generations been influenced and influential? We'll start with that baby boomer generation, very large population globally. And when we look at some of the influences of this generation, we know that that one of them is looking at stability, looking at, when you look at this picture, the typical grade school picture of this generation, we can see that there are many similarities. People are wearing the same outfits. They have the same haircuts. Everyone's wearing dark shoes. That idea of consistency, stability was evident in the boomer generation. But when the boomers came on the scene, they were raised to be the next great generation. It was a post-war era. There were ample job opportunities, more people going to college, attending, getting great jobs. The market was booming. The economy was booming. In fact, this generation became the wealthiest, most prosperous generation in history. But as we look at their influences, they were raised to follow a very similar path as the generation that came before them and the generation that came before them, in that you would go to school, you would get a job, you would get married, you would have children, in that order, I might add. And everyone watched fairly family-friendly programming together, and you would get a job and you would work in that job, perhaps at the same company, until you retired. But then, boom, something happened. A major wave of change. An entirely new generation is born. Generation X, a very small population in comparison to the baby boomer generation. Generation X is called X because they were born at the crossroads of cultural and social change. So when we look at civil rights, women's rights, lots of changes happening in society during this time. One of the best visuals I can show is of the Beatles, because the Beatles came on the scene at the tail end of the boomer generation in 1964. Notice once again how everyone kind of looks the same. Just as in that grade school picture, there's that sense of conformity, right? But just 3 years later, in 1967, it's the Gen X era, and the Beatles look like this. Oh my gosh, what happened? So this is really important. Anyone born in 1964 or earlier was raised to value that idea of conformity, blending in, following certain social rules. But anyone born in 1965 and later has been raised to value individuality. Do what you want. Do what makes you happy. And boy, do we see this play out in the workforce. We're going to talk about that in a little bit greater detail momentarily. But that idea of pursue your own happiness, do what you want, well, some people blame this man for that. Because all of a sudden we had a childhood educator telling children, you are special, you are unique, do what makes you happy. And as long as you're doing what makes you happy, maybe that means divorce. Almost overnight, the divorce rate for the parents of Xers skyrocketed. And now we have the majority of Gen Xers being raised in either two-parent working households or single-parent households. They became the first generation of latchkey children, largely raised to be very self-sufficient and independent. In the 1970s, that introduced decades of mergers, layoffs, downsizing. Generation X became the first generation never to really know job security. In 1980, cable television arrived. Might not seem like a very big deal, but all of a sudden you have access to news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And let's face it, folks, sometimes that news is good news, but most of the time it's bad news. Now we have a generation being raised on this access to increased information and negativity. They are the first generation from the time they're young children to see the nation's leaders lie, fail to deliver on their promises. They saw the dawn of customization, that's a trend that hasn't gone away, as well as the dawn of globalization. Instead of Woodstock, this generation was having Live Aid. Another trend with globalization that hasn't gone away. But by and large, change began to accelerate, and initially this led to a lot of rebellion. Those of you who are Xers in the audience will recognize Twisted Sister and their mantra, "We're not going to take it anymore." So we got used to one wave of change, and then boom, there's another wave, and another generation is born. This generation is significant because they become the largest generation in history, even larger than the baby boomer generation, which means they wield a lot of power and a lot of influence. They've also been the most studied generation in history, the most criticized generation in history, largely because this generation really became the personification of change. Tremendous amount of change accompanied them into the workforce. Let's take a look. This generation, like Gen X, have also observed the nation's leaders lying, failing to deliver on their promises. They actually saw the fall of entire corporations due to unethical practices. But this generation also observed some radically different influences, a lot of violence close to home, from school shootings to September 11. So we saw the pendulum shift from really hands-off parenting, with Gen Xers especially, who were raised to be very self-sufficient, but also with boomers, just be home in time for dinner type of mentality. We saw that hands-off parenting become extreme hands-on, or what's become known as helicopter parenting. Millennials are, in fact, the most supervised, protected, provided for generation in history. Think about car seats, bike helmets, never eating in a cafeteria that serves peanut butter. Many of them moved back home after college. They've been dubbed the trophy generation because they've always been rewarded for participation, not achievements. Who go out for the team, everybody gets a trophy. And as young adults, we've seen this emerge into this need for ROI, return on investment. If I'm giving you my valuable time and skills in the workforce, what are you doing for me in return? We all know this generation's been raised using technology, but you might not fully comprehend what that means if you're not a millennial. From the time they were very young on basic needs assessments, this generation would rank access to technology on the same level as access to oxygen and freedom. Think about that for just a moment. In other words, if you've never known life without technology, you can't even fathom it. Can't even fathom it. They had a very rocky transition from college to career. They have become known, in addition to being the trophy kid generation, the delayed adulthood generation, the failure to launch generation, because they are the most debt-ridden generation in history. Many of them graduated during the time of the recession, and as a result had a very rocky transition from college to career. As I mentioned previously, we are now observing Generation Z. The oldest Zs are just beginning to enter the workforce, and they are, of course, going to be heavily influenced by this social shift that COVID-19 is now introducing into our world. That remains to be seen how it's going to influence this generation, but here's what we know about them so far. Generation Z, like millennials, have been raised using technology, but for them it's always been mobile. They've always had the world literally at their fingertips. They've always had the answer to every question thanks to Google. And they've been raised during this era that really celebrates diversity and inclusion. They use social media that is highly instantaneous, highly visual. They actually consume and create more content than any other generation. And there is now proof to research to prove that their brains have developed differently than any other generation, in that they obtain information and memories almost exclusively through videos and photos. So imagine how our marketing is going to change down the road. We are moving into an era of real visual learning. As I mentioned, they've been raised during this era that celebrates diversity and inclusion. You think about anti-bullying campaigns, marriage equality campaigns. It's all about making sure everyone has a seat at the table and a voice. Everyone is included. Think about what that means for your future workforce. Are you very inclusive of younger generations and their opinions? Interestingly enough, they've also been raised during an era that celebrates heroes. And we actually hear this hero mentality come out in our conversations and focus groups and interviews with this generation. They tend to be a very serious, sincere generation. They worry about the state of the world. They haven't worried so much about typical teen problems. And of course, the COVID-19 situation will merely accelerate this mindset. They feel personally responsible for improving the state of the world. Just as millennials ushered in this digital age very quickly, we're moving to a cyber age, starting to hear a lot more about robotics and artificial intelligence, or traveling to the moon, or living on Mars. And Gen Z absolutely embraces these concepts. I want to show you a writing sample of a Gen Z child from this boy. It's the son of a friend of mine. A few years ago when he was younger, his kindergarten class was asked to write 3 sentences about themselves. This Gen Z boy wrote, "I can poop, I can pee, I have an iPhone." So that shows you that technology mindset that's right automatically built into literally at a childhood stage, and how these influences influence us as generations. But when we go back in history to that boomer era and we bring it up to present day, it really boils down to that one word, that concept of change. Unprecedented, quick, fast, huge amounts of change. As I mentioned earlier, that change is either really challenging our organizations, or we're learning to embrace it. It's either a tremendous burden or a tremendous opportunity, but there's no denying that we're at the end of work as we know it, and that each generation is bringing new skills and mindsets and values to our workplace as a result of this unprecedented change. But in so many ways, we are being asked, we are being expected as leaders to rethink and innovate and recreate and redefine this concept of work and what we do day in and day out, and how we treat those that we're working with. There are often questions as to whether generational differences actually exist. There's still that debate out there. I want to show you some real proof that they do exist. Again, when we look at generational differences, we're looking at those childhood influences, those teenage influences, and how it shapes our behaviors and values. And this is not to say that every single person in a generation will have the exact same values, but there are indeed very clear trends. The majority will tend to have the same values and behaviors. So for example, when we do global research on this and we ask generations, how do you prefer to be communicated with? Not every person in every generation will say the exact same, but there are definite trends. Baby boomers will say they want to communicate face-to-face. Gen Xers will say they prefer communicating via email. Millennials will say text. And you might be surprised to find out what Gen Z is saying. We've done global research on this. Gen Z is actually saying face-to-face. We're actually seeing a return, a little bit of tech fatigue going on. Yes, they're still using their technology for entertainment, but they say when it comes to the workplace, 100% they want that face-to-face. They really value that. But here we see generational differences in how we communicate. We also see generational differences in how we describe the ideal leader. For example, baby boomers, the majority, will say they want a leader that's wise, that's smart, that's experienced, knowledgeable. Probably because there's a little bit of that hierarchy mindset built in. It's always been about the experienced and wise leader. For Gen Z, they say they want an honest leader. Not surprising considering all the disruption, all the lies that Gen Z came of age alongside. Millennials say they want a collaborative leader. Here again, not surprising considering they've been raised as the most protected, supervised, provided for generation in history. They were raised with very close relationships with the adults in their lives, parents, teachers, coaches, mentors. They want that same experience in the workplace. And Gen Z, for them, they want leaders who are positive. Again, when we look at the social shifts and influences that have occurred in their young lives, they've seen a lot of disruption. They've come of age during the most disruptive decade in history, especially in the political climate, which has been very polarizing. And so they're wanting positive influences in their lives, not negative or toxic. This one is especially important for you to ask among your teams. As leaders, we've got to know what's challenging people in our on our teams to really understand them and gain some empathy, and which eventually leads to acceptance. But what's challenging us? Well, for baby boomers, it's change, keeping pace with technology. It's understanding how to stay relevant and meaningful in a very disruptive marketplace. They're feeling challenged and threatened by that. Gen Xers are wanting work-life balance. They're often caring for aging relatives at the same time they're caring for children under the age of 18, and they're pulled in that constant battle between that work-life balance. Millennials desperately want to be taken seriously. They want respect. As I mentioned, they've been heavily criticized. They are the most studied, most criticized generation, being the personification of change. And Gen Zs are saying anxiety. They are the most anxious, depressed generation, likely because from a young age, they've had such an incredible awareness and education and access to information about the world and all that's going on in it. So they're very well educated, very well informed, but at the same time, that's making them feel a little out of control and anxious. This is great insight as to what's going to happen in the future, especially with COVID-19 now in the mix. We're likely going to see in the future this move towards workplaces that are more balanced, more focused on us as people, and ensuring that we have healthy work environments and taking the time to make healthy decisions at work. The point with all of this, as we look at different generations, their influences, their values, amidst all of this change, something really magnificent has happened. And here again, it's something we don't really pause to think about. But for the first time in history, every generation has something to learn and something to teach. That's new. That's unprecedented. Because throughout history, we've always had hierarchy. The elder of any given society had all the power, all the wisdom. Everyone gathered around to learn from the elder. But now, because of all this change, because of all this access to new information, totally new values and mindsets and skill sets, now we have realized that every generation has something of value to contribute. We need to be very aware of the different mindsets, different opinions, different ideas and skills that every generation can bring to our workplaces. I would encourage you as leaders to really be mindful in these coming months, this coming year, to constantly be asking yourself, am I both learning and teaching from everyone who I work with? Am I both learning and teaching? Now, there's another way of looking at all of this change, and it is not just generational, it's also a little bit economic. You see, Generation X, boomers, whether you realize it or not, you are the last generations of the industrial era. As crazy as that might sound, because, the industrial era was founded in the 1700s. How could we possibly still be in an industrial era? Well, when you think about it, in the industrial era, these core concepts and management principles existed. Every organization and structure, every department would have a hierarchy. There was very linear thinking and scheduling and processes. Everything had a schedule, everything had a process. You would do A and then B and then C. You would start your career at the bottom of the ladder and work your way up. Everything was organized according to linear thinking. However, for the generations that have followed, Millennials and Generation Z, they've been raised during this era that is fueled by ideas and innovation, instant gratification, flexibility, mobility, customization, globalization, and so much more. In other words, linear thinking and processes have really been thrown out the window and replaced with this ideas in innovation, instant gratification mindset. So not surprising, we tend to have these gaps in the workplace. And if I boiled all the gaps down to one core concept, one core reason, it is this. We have industrial era thinking and managed organizations and leaders trying desperately to engage and retain the talent of post-industrial raised workers and leaders, and it's not working. I'm going to show you a chart to explain what's happening. In this industrial mindset, these organizations tend to be run by hierarchy. They focus on the bottom line, on profitability more than anything else. They celebrate experience, seek to be reliable, manage people, maintain status quo. They focus on the work, on the job, and they talk a lot about the past, the good old days. But in this new era, this post-industrial era, which has also been referred to as a talent-driven economy, it is virtually the opposite in every single way. It's collaborative. It's putting people first. It's seeking to be innovative and adaptable, to lead the way, disrupt the norm, focus on the purpose, a greater mission, a call to action, and focus and concentrate and talk a lot and plan for the future. So here's my question to all of you on today's summit, Congress session. Which of these columns best describes your organization? Are you in the red column? Are you more industrial thinking and managed? Or are you in the blue column? Are you more a talent economy ready, future ready? And I think we will find that many of us are in that red zone. Maybe there is recognition and a little bit of effort beginning to move to that blue zone, but data repeatedly shows us that most organizations, most leaders are stuck in red. There are many outcomes to this. One I will focus on right now, and that is how we judge one another in our workplaces. For boomers and Xers, they tend to judge themselves and judge others based on their results and professionalism in the workforce. Did you get the job done? How professional are you? Are you well dressed? How experienced are you? How many credentials do you have under your belt? And so on. But for the talent economy thinkers, they judge themselves and others based on potential and ambition. As a result, perhaps you've heard it in your own workforce. You will have young people say, well, I deserve the raise or I deserve the job because I have had the drive to learn, as opposed to Gen Xers and Boomers who would say you don't get the job or the raise or the kudos until you have the experience. So here is just one example of how that tug of war between the two mindsets plays out. Tell me, what is wrong with this picture? Anyone notice anything? If you remember back when Facebook had its IPO, Mark Zuckerberg showed up and it started an absolute media firestorm because the CEO showed up wearing a hoodie. Yes, a hoodie. This is a great example of that blue zone thinking as opposed to red zone thinking. The media were quite vicious with Mr. Zuckerberg, saying things like the baby-faced CEO flunked him badly. Maybe he should consider a career change. There are other CEOs suitable for this job, and he is not. We, of course, have learned throughout time that Mark Zuckerberg would end up wearing his hoodie absolutely everywhere. In fact, it became known as Hoodiegate, and there was a lot of controversy over wardrobe choices. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg went underground for a period of time following this IPO, which didn't go over so well, especially amidst all of this criticism of what he wore to the IPO. And he didn't do any interviews for a few years, but then eventually he agreed to do an interview. And of course, one of the first questions the reporter asked him was, Mr. Zuckerberg, please do tell us, why is it that you wear a hoodie? Why is it that you pretty much wear the same outfit day in and day out? And Mr. Zuckerberg's response really surprised everybody and shocked everyone, because he said, I wear the same thing because I'm trying to build a company capable of influencing over 1 billion people. So when I get up every day, I don't want to spend my mental energy thinking about things that aren't important to this mission. If it doesn't relate directly to my mission to influence over 1 billion people, then it's not important. It's not worth my time and energy. Now, it was shortly after they're revealed that Mark Zuckerberg's mentor, one of his many mentors, was Steve Jobs. And of course, Steve Jobs did the same thing, wearing the same outfit for a long period of time, pretty much the exact same outfit for over a decade. But he wasn't criticized for it the way Zuckerberg was. And possibly because Steve Jobs became famous much later in his life than Mark Zuckerberg. In any case, it's a great example of that mindset, that tug of war that's happening between generations in our workplace. Now, there's something else that's happening in our workplace as well, and it's that fear of change. As I mentioned previously, millennials are really that personification of change. Actually, every young generation is the personification of change. We experience this initial feeling that young people are introducing so much change, we don't like it. Young people are going to make us feel like we're irrelevant. Our skills aren't meaningful anymore. And it triggers this feeling of fear. When baby boomers came of age, they were criticized by their elders for being hippies and tree huggers. They were never going to amount to anything. When Gen X came of age, they were chastised for being slackers. And of course, millennials have been the trophy kids and the snowflakes. And the delayed adulthood generation, in any case, were super harsh on the youngest generations when they come of age. And ladies and gentlemen, that is strictly from a place of fear. We're all afraid of something. For me, it's spiders. I hate spiders. Everyone is afraid of something. But widely, research indicates almost all of us have some fear of change. And part of that is scientific. It's how our brains are wired, quite literally. You see, when we encounter change, it lights up our prefrontal cortex. And initially, we feel pretty excited about that change. We feel ready and willing to take it on and embrace it. However, the cortex's capacity is quite limited. So within a very short period of time, we feel burnout towards the change, anger, resentment, frustration. That's where that fear creeps in. And over time, our brains kind of like getting used to something. They like routine. They like stability. It creates these ruts in our brain. And anytime we're forced to get outside the box and get into a new rut, our brains resist it. So it's partly scientific, but our fear of change is also rooted in our management practices, in our business world, because we tend to reward our leaders for doing more of the same. In 1965, executive pay was just 24 times worker pay. But today it is 275 times worker pay. In other words, we keep paying our leaders more and more and more. They keep doing more and more of the same. Why would anyone want to change what they're doing when they're getting compensated to just maintain status quo, to just stay in that red zone? So we have these ingrained, whether it's science or actual monetary reward, we have these obstacles to overcome in our workplace and our mindsets to allow for change. And unfortunately, because of these knee-jerk reactions to change, we tend to point the finger. We never look within our organizations. When we encounter challenges to adapting to change, when we begin to see teamwork fall apart, or we are unable to retain talent, we tend to look at those young professionals we're struggling to relate to, and we criticize them. I mean, come on. Those millennials, they have no concept of loyalty. They don't plan for the future. They want constant feedback. They want everything online. They don't value experience, can't make decisions, have no work ethic. They aren't reliable. They're demanding, they're annoying, they're lazy. It has to be their problem as to why our organization can't engage them. It has to be an entire generation's character flaw. It certainly could have nothing to do with me and my leadership ability, certainly nothing to do with our organization and our inability to adapt, right? There is a solution to all of this. It's very simple. It's collaboration. You see, when we bring people together and we practice something called cognitive diversity, and we bring people of different backgrounds and experiences, and we put that learn and teach mentality into our actual business practices, we do so much better. Our organizations are more capable of innovation. They're more productive. The relationships thrive. We're working as teams. We're empathetic. We're accepting. We're able to make change. But it's only through collaboration. When you're working together as a team, you're not afraid anymore because someone's got your back. They're in the trenches with you. When you're working with people of different backgrounds and skill sets, and you have that cognitive diversity that only multi-generational teams can provide, you are ready for anything, any change. You can tackle it. that cognitive diversity is absolutely key to our future success. So I'm going to ask you to do something collaborative right now. I'm going to ask you to pause for a moment, take a selfie of yourself. Take a selfie of yourself sitting in your virtual office watching today's webinar. I'm at the Structures Conference, and it might not be in St. Louis, but it's here virtually. So just pause for a moment, take a selfie, get into that mindset of collaboration. And then I would love to see all these selfies posted. Please share them with me. I want to see your collaborative efforts. And I'm sure SEI would also love to see them. Their Twitter hashtag is at ASCE_SEI. So please share. Now, what do selfies have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, quite a lot. If you've noticed in recent years, there's been celebrities, the Pope, our former president, royalty, so many people taking selfies. And even pets have been taking selfies. But the selfie is a great example of what I call trickle-up effect. You see, throughout history, the trends and innovations that have started and taken hold, had real root in our social shifts. They've always started with the youngest generations. Think about rock and roll with the baby boomers, Harley Davidson, Facebook. It wasn't that long ago Facebook was designed by college students for college students. Now we have grandmas and grandpas using Facebook. But the point is this: if we're not in conversation and practicing that collaboration and cognitive diversity with younger generations, if we're not really aware of the trends that will influence our businesses, we totally become irrelevant. We stay in that red zone and we're never moving forward. We're never moving and adapting and evolving towards that blue zone. And the more irrelevant we become, the more difficult it is to get talent, the more difficult it is to bridge generation gaps and foster teamwork. And that is even including innovation, which becomes an almost impossible obstacle. It is absolutely critical to pay attention to who and what is coming next. A couple of years ago, I authored a book titled Talent Generation, and I want to share with you some of the stories that I gleaned as a result of researching that book. And the first one comes from Bob, the U.S. chair for PwC, very large company. He shared in Harvard Business Review a very large editorial pleading with his fellow leaders and CEOs that please, please, please pay attention to younger generations. Don't make the same mistake that I did. He realized that even though his company was bringing in and recruiting 8,000 new young people every single year, so many of them were leaving. And it wasn't until they did an employee survey that he realized how little he knew about them. And he realized he had never taken the time to get to know one new young person on his staff. And of course, it wasn't until he began to really pay attention to the trends, to the people, to who and what was coming next, and fostering that teamwork, was PwC able to reverse that trend and decline. We're all familiar with the Kodak story, or are we? Kodak is renowned for not switching to digital photography fast enough, staying in that red zone, not innovating, but they were in the red zone for more reasons than one. They actually, just a year or so prior to claiming bankruptcy, Kodak was cited as having one of the oldest workforces in the United States. In other words, they just stopped recruiting and retaining young talent. And there again, they lacked collaboration, cognitive diversity. They were unable to see the trends and respond to them effectively. Put that into contrast to EY, which was founded in the early 1900s, much like Kodak, but they are thriving. They are hosting high school town halls. They are hosting events focused on robotics. And they say that the secret to their success, which they're constantly bringing young talent, their recruitment efforts and their retention is off the charts. But they say it's because they are always pushing towards that blue zone. They're always pushing towards innovation. They're always bringing in new ideas, learning and teaching, focusing on teamwork, thinking about how they're developing their people and putting their people first. It's collaboration. Collaboration is the solution. But there's something else I noticed about these organizations that were doing really exceptionally well when I was researching the book. All of these organizations do these two things better than any other organization out there. And it's why they have very high-performing teams, high employee engagement, and high profitability. They put their people first and they stay future focused. No matter what, people first, future focused. Think about that mindset in your own organizations. Whether you realize it or not, you've been heavily influenced by these guys who started their company in a garage, the founders of Google. Yes, they created this great technology, which we all utilize today. But more than that, they dramatically changed work as we know it, because they founded their company in the late 1990s. And they announced shortly after their company's founding that they were going to create a revolutionary new concept to management, because they believed that people want meaningful work, knowledge of what's happening in their environment, and the opportunity to shape their environment. And they believed that if they created a company that was based on these principles alone, it wouldn't matter what type of business they were running. Employee engagement, teamwork, profitability would be really, really high. Now, we all know the story and how it turned out for Google. But at the time, they were heavily criticized for this, because at the time, we were all still in that red zone. We couldn't see the blue zone at all. We were heavily ingrained in that industrial era thinking. And the founders of Google were heavily criticized. They said, that's fluff. No one's going to go for that. That is meaningless. It has to be all about profitability. But Google has since proved us wrong. Leonardo da Vinci, he himself, an engineer, obviously well known for all of his major achievements, but this quote, "Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do." And that's what I'm going to encourage and challenge you to do with this information. There's so much advantage to having a multi-generational team, but it really ultimately comes down to you. You make the choice. What kind of leader are you going to be? What kind of mindset will you have? Will you stay in the red zone, or will you move your organization towards blue? What can you positively influence? How can you collaborate and bring teams together? Because there's one thing that's certain. We are all different generations with different skill sets and values, but we have one core similarity. We all, regardless of our age, regardless of our career, regardless of our role, we all want to belong. We want to be part of a team, part of a bigger mission. We want to feel valuable and that our contribution matters. We all fear change to some capacity, but now more than ever, especially as a leader, it's absolutely imperative that you overcome that fear and that you're able to see past it, see your future, create a vision, and be an inspiration to your teams. Because there's one truth in every aspect of business and in life. Either we're changing and we're growing and we're evolving, or we're dying. There is no middle ground. You need to lead your organizations towards change. You need to lead your organizations towards collaboration, towards that blue zone. You need to pave the way and make room for the next generation, because ready or not, they are on their way. You need to make sure that you are building something that really really stays resilient regardless of the change, and really fosters relationships and builds upon these wonderful foundations that every generation can bring. Be the place, be the leader, the one that everyone wants to be a part of, the one that fosters teamwork, collaboration, cognitive diversity, the one that puts people first and stays future focused. And you will see greater success with every generation at work. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. It was an honor to be here.
Sarah, that was fantastic. And judging from the questions that we've gotten in, you've connected with our audience really well. So we have time now to take questions. Sarah, the first is this. You mentioned the need for generations to collaborate and certainly threw down a great challenge for baby boomers and Gen Xers to embrace change. What's your advice for Millennials and Gen Zers in this mutual collaboration?
So I think for young people, there's a great opportunity to just speak up, ask and invite, be part of the conversation, part of that dialogue piece. In order to have some cognitive diversity in our workplaces, we have to make sure that everyone has a voice, everyone has a seat at the table. If you aren't given that seat at the table, at least take time to seek out mentors. Take time to invite someone out to lunch that you work with, and do your part to foster those intergenerational relationships yourself.
Great. And here's another question that I think is related, but it speaks to the large age gap between some generations. Do you have any additional comments or suggestions about effective communication between those generations that may have large age gaps?
Mm-hmm. So yes, we have seen generations span larger age gaps, especially with baby boomers and Gen Xers, even within those generations, because change is now happening faster. And so generations are now getting shorter in terms of their time spans. As far as generational workforces where you have a real large age span and age difference, those generational gaps can be very prevalent. As I mentioned in my comments, it's a great idea just to start having dialogues, just to ask people, what are you challenged with? I think it's also great as leaders to take time, as I mentioned, going out to lunch with others that you work with and fostering that interdepartmental lunch activity. Take someone new out to lunch every month. Or in this era of COVID-19, it's maybe having a Zoom chat with someone different every month or every week, getting to know one another. That helps to foster those relationships. And it's also a great exercise for leaders to just take some time, develop your own young think tank. You know, start talking literally with the future and with those that you work with, but also perhaps young professionals outside of your workplace, to have that future focused mindset and really dive into acceptance and empathy.
Great comments, thanks. This next question is that your description of the profiles of Gen Zers seems rather different than Millennials. So do you have any thoughts on how things will continue to change as the Gen Zers become more prominent in the workplace? The differences between multiple generations seems complicated. Do you have any suggestions, for example, for Millennials to embrace Gen Zs and vice versa?
Yes. Well, so as more Gen Zs enter the workforce, and it is an interesting time because we are experiencing history right now. What's happening right now is certainly shaping our values and will continue to further shape Generation Z because they're experiencing childhood and adolescence during this time of disruption. But what we know for already, for a fact, based on our research, and I think that the current situation is just going to accentuate it. Generation Z really seeks stability. So being in an era of disruption and a lot of change happening, they're wanting secure jobs. They're wanting secure relationships. Millennials tend to want that as well, but millennials also tend to approach things from more of a collaborative standpoint, and they're seeking more of a return on their investment. And I think the key point is that, yes, to recognize that we have perhaps differences, different viewpoints, different skill sets, but also to look for the similarities that we have within our teams and find the commonalities, the common culture within your workforce, the common values, the shared experiences, and really focus on those as well as seeking to understand what differentiates us and our skill sets.
Great, thank you. While you were speaking, a follow-up question came in on a similar topic. Do you have any thoughts on how many generations is a good idea to have engaged in a conversation at one time or a team? What's the most productive mix of generations and a less productive one? Any thoughts about that?
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I think it's great to have as many generations as possible. Again, that's where you get the real cognitive diversity. The more diversity there is, the richer the conversation and the skill sets and the innovation and productivity that occurs. In fact, Nielsen Research has done research, and the most diverse teams in terms of cognitive diversity tend to by far be the most productive and innovative in comparison to teams of similar ages and similar backgrounds. So I think the more the merrier. If you have everyone from baby boomers to Generation Z, that's fabulous. Be inclusive of everyone on your team.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Here's a challenging one. We have, as I mentioned earlier, people from over 60 countries on the line. And the question is, we are a global organization. We work in a very flat world right now with lots of people working from all over the world. Does your research about generational data apply to countries outside the US? And to what extent? And have you experienced other parts of the world where it's even more complex because the same generational norms that you've talked about don't apply?
These are good questions, tough questions. And I did see on Twitter, I love that seeing some of the selfies coming through, and I'm seeing people in Dubai and the UK and elsewhere. And so, yes, it's amazing, this global audience. So based on our research, we find that in every developed nation, the generational trends tend to be the same. There might be some different experiences and some minor differences, but by and large, the behaviors, the shared values, some of the traits, they tend to be very, very similar, especially among millennials and Generation Z, because now we are living in a very global environment. And these are generations that have been raised during this era of technology and being able to communicate and do business with and learn from people all over the world. So our world is truly getting smaller and flatter. And this COVID-19 experience means that we're all experiencing something, regardless of where we live, for the first time in history together. So it is certainly shaping our generations. But yes, we find that regardless of where you live, as long as it is a developed nation, the generational traits and behaviors are the same.
Okay. Any predictions yet on how this pandemic will influence us personally and professionally?
So I think as we look forward, we will have, we've really been pushed into the future. We will be seeing more of a combination of virtual and in-person offered. I think when it comes to events, there will be, you can be there in person, but there will also be a virtual stream, and possibly that will even happen with education. Where we'll have online education combined with in-person, in-school education. I think we're going to start to see more emphasis. We've been on this path for a while, but greater emphasis on work-life balance, making sure that we are healthy as professionals, healthy personally, and that we're able to work virtually, take care of children. We'll be more flexible and adaptable in our schedulings to allow for more work-life balance. Mm-hmm. And I also think there will be a greater emphasis on making sure our environment, our climate is healthy. Mm-hmm. And last year, the United Nations, so talk about a global shared experience, the United Nations came out and said that they would really like to emphasize and focus on, in the next couple of years, not just working for youth, but working with youth. And that's a sign of a trend that's to come. They're urging businesses and organizations to be very mindful of younger generations and working side by side with them and bringing in young people to help shape our futures collectively. And so I think we're also going to see this move towards more youth involvement, more of a school to work almost mentality. They'll start learning about careers earlier, being involved in businesses earlier. And in the end, we'll all benefit.
That's fantastic. Sarah, I wish we had time for all of the wonderful questions that came in. We'll find a way to pass them on to you in a different venue. And thank you for all of you out there for offering your questions. But Sarah, your message certainly resonates with today's SEI leadership, I can tell you that. And they're very committed to empowering the next generation of structural engineering leaders. Great things, I think, are happening in the pursuit of our future vision, which have given us a lot of wisdom to help accelerate that intergenerational collaboration. So thank you so much for a great session. Now we'll take a 10-minute break.
Welcome back from the break. Again, I'm Laura Champion, Director of SEI at ASCE. It's my pleasure now to introduce the next presentation by Glenn Bell, Alistair Sohn, and Andy Herman on the developments of the recently launched CROSS-US, the new SEI program on confidential reporting on structural safety in the United States. After the presentation, there will be a live Q&A chat with our audience again. Remember to submit your questions at any time or after the presentation via the chat box on your screen.
Good afternoon. I'm Glenn Bell. I was introduced earlier in this virtual Congress event as the current president of SEI. I'm also one of the two directors of Confidential Reporting on Structural Safety US, or CROSS-US. This session is about structural reliability, but not in the sense that we usually discuss it at Structures Congresses. We have no equations. We're not going to discuss reliability indices, but a reliable structure is one that has a high probability of survival and low probability of failure. As structural engineers, we seek to design innovative, elegant, sustainable, and efficient structures. But in the end, avoiding failure permeates everything that we do. Whether you're an entry-level structural engineer, a project manager, or company leader, you must be ever vigilant. We must use every tool in our arsenal to assure structural safety, and we need to continuously learn and grow. Learning from failures, our own and those of others, has always been an essential part of learning and growing as structural engineers, individually and collectively. As a profession, we've learned how powerful systematic learning from failures can be, but it's also difficult, and our attention to it has ebbed and flowed. However, we recently introduced a system to the United States that helps to overcome some of the difficulties we faced in the past: confidential reporting on structural safety. As background for this session, I'll review our experience as designers and builders in learning from failures and the challenges that come with it, particularly in the US. And then I'll turn it over to Alistair Sohn. Alistair is from the UK, where he had a long career as a structural engineer and was CEO of a prominent consulting engineering firm. Since 2005, Alistair has been Director of Structural Safety in London. At Structural Safety, he founded the system of confidential reporting on structural safety, or CROSS, that we will discuss today. Alistair is one of the UK's foremost authorities on structural safety. He'll describe the rationale for the CROSS approach, cite examples of its positive influence, and report on its rise in prominence in the UK and internationally since the 2017 Grenville Tower disaster. Following Alistair, Andy Herman will review the introduction of CROSS in the US and its launch here in July of 2019. He'll describe how CROSS works and share examples of some recent case reports processed by CROSS US. I know Andy is familiar to many of you. He is partner emeritus of Hardesty and Hanover, where he was an expert in movable bridges. Andy was 2012 president of ASCE and 2017 president of SEI. Presently, Andy is also one of the two directors of CROSS US. Over the many thousands of years of our history as builders, observing performance was all we had. We would build, and if performance was good, we were emboldened to build larger and more daring structures. When failure occurred, we learned, adapted, and often innovated. For millennia, this worked spectacularly well. I love to study the great European Gothic cathedrals. They're a fantastic testament to the power of learning from failures. Look at the progression of this string of cathedrals from Leon, started in 1153, to Beauvais, 1225, a span of less than 100 years. Each one taller, slenderer, and more daring than its predecessor. The drive for innovation was much like the evolution of tall buildings today. Each city wanted to have the most spectacular cathedral. We know that the Gothic builders learned and adapted their designs as they progressed, and not infrequently experienced distress and often collapse. The innovations of flying buttresses, pinnacles, and vaulting were the results of their thoughtful learning. Then came the Renaissance, and we began to develop mathematically based structural theory. Here are just a few of our early heroes in our Structural Engineering Hall of Fame. Galileo was an early developer of beam theory. He famously got it wrong, but he inspired us to find the correct solution. Hooke, famous for Hooke's law, the relationship between stress and strain in a linear elastic system. His work was quite groundbreaking, I think, for the 17th century. Bernoulli, along with Euler, got beam theory right. And Navier is credited with developing the general theory of elasticity. After the work of these early heroes and others following, we began to increasingly rely on mathematical theory, so that today it's the principal basis for our codes and design procedures. And attention to learning from failures began to fade. Along the way, we started experimenting with load tests. We know that Galileo tested cantilever beams to advance his theories. There's always been a strong connection between testing and mathematically based structural theory. One validates or informs the other. Today, our basis for structural safety is a three-legged stool of mathematical structural theory, laboratory testing, and observing the performance of what we build. All three are essential. Each leg has its strengths and weaknesses. Each leg informs and complements the others. As mathematical theory has advanced and we have come to rely more heavily on it, our attention to observation of the performance of what we build has, very unfortunately, faded. We can't, of course, return to the days of the Gothic builders. They took huge risks and made stuff up as they went. Our legal, business, and cultural environments are vastly different now. But this does not diminish the relevance of the power of learning from failures. Our built environment is our living laboratory. It's our ultimate measure of our performance as designers and builders. While the other two legs of the stool have their own strengths, observation of our built environment is the only leg that captures all the variables impacting structural safety. And critically, it's the only leg that helps us understand and learn from the procedural causes of failures. In the US, we've almost always learned technical lessons from the infrequent catastrophic news-making failure. Every high school physics student learns about the problems of wind-induced harmonics of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And this catastrophe certainly influenced bridge design. The important lesson from Tacoma Narrows, however, is not technical, it's procedural. The important lesson from Tacoma Narrows is about the risk of scaling up. That is, technologies and concepts that are successful at one scale may be inadequate at larger scales. To this day, lack of recognition of scaling problems is a common source of failures. This is just one example of our need to generalize the lessons we learn about the procedural causes of failure. Learning from failures in the US continued to be the undervalued leg of the three-legged stool of structural safety. And then starting in the late 1970s, we had a huge wake-up call during what I call the decade of disaster. We experienced an unprecedented number of catastrophic collapses, the most prominent of them listed here. These were complete, generally sudden collapses, in many cases with tragic loss of life. I was involved in the investigation of two of these for Simpson, Gupperts, and Hager, and otherwise have made a personal study of all of them. These disasters shook us and reminded us of the gravity of the responsibility we bear as structural engineers, and of our obligation to learn from them. Why did this rash of disasters happen then? We don't really know. The technical causes of all of them were different. We do know, however, that they were far more caused by outright haste, shortcuts, and blunders than lack of technical knowledge. Alarms went off in our profession, and the issue rose to national attention. Congress held a series of hearings to determine what had gone wrong. After the Hyatt disaster, ASCE focused substantial resources on improving quality in our constructed works. In 1982, we formed an ASCE Committee on Forensic Engineering, charged with learning from failures and reducing their incidence. The activity and size of the committee grew, and in 1985 it was elevated to a Technical Council on Forensic Engineering, or TCFE. This is a photo from the first meeting of the XCOM of TCFE. In 1987, the TCFE launched a new journal, the Journal of Performance of Constructed Facilities, which largely publishes case studies on failures and other performance problems. Recognizing TCFE's continued growth and influence, it was elevated to a division of ASCE around 2013. Beyond the ASCE journal, there have been many excellent efforts in publishing information on failures. We can't possibly give credit to all of them here, but they include reports by the National Bureau of Standards, now NIST, continuous coverage in Engineering News Record, many books, natural hazards post-disaster reconnaissance reports, and online failures wikis. These efforts have made tremendous contributions to learning the technical causes of failures and raising our awareness. We found it to be more difficult, however, to address the procedural causes of failures and to convert lessons learned into improved practice. By procedural causes of failure, I mean the human errors, process issues, and general organizational conditions that cause the technical shortcomings that lead to failures. Anecdotally, we know that problems occur far more frequently due to procedural problems than lack of technical understanding. We've been stymied in comprehensive learning from the technical and procedural causes of failure for several reasons. Number one, in-depth knowledge of failure causes is often tied up in legal proceedings with consequent prohibitions on disseminating such knowledge that last for years, if not forever. Two, the objectivity of forensic engineers who work in a legal environment is sometimes called into question. Three, we've had no continuous and consistent way to process procedural lessons. Four, we've had no single source of information for one to go to for lessons learned. And finally, five, we've had no systematic way of getting lessons learned into the hands of entities able to positively affect change. As a result, we've had a gap, a critical gap, in effectively converting lessons learned into improved practice. In the UK, their analog to our decade of disaster came about a decade earlier. Systematic attention to learning from failures came after these two incidents. On the left, the progressive collapse in 1968 of a portion of the 22-story Ronan Point Tower, following a small gas explosion in a kitchen. And on the right, the collapse of the Milford Haven Bridge in Wales in 1970 due to lateral instability at one of the bridge pier support diaphragms. These failures led to the formation in 1976 of the UK Standing Committee on Structural Safety, or SCOSS. This is the analog to our ASCE Committee on Forensic Engineering. SCOST faced many of the same challenges we have in disseminating lessons on the causes of failure, and the response was their creation of CROSS in 2005. Alistair will pick up the story from here.
Thank you, Glenn. My name is Alistair Soane from the UK, and I am Director of the Structural Safety Group, which includes CROSS. We have been working closely with Glenn, Andy, and others in the CROSS US team for several years to develop the ideas that we are now sharing. One of the first principles is to assess risk, and this can be illustrated by a risk pyramid. These are used in aviation, finance, medicine, and now structures. At the lowest level are normal operations during which nothing goes wrong. And then come smaller slices for incidents, occurrences where there are injuries, and those where there are fatalities. The top level events will normally be the responsibility of regulatory authorities, but everything below that can be reported to CROSS. CROSS stands for Confidential Reporting on Structural Safety, and this is a voluntary system. We are sponsored by the two main professional engineering institutions in the UK, the Institution of Structural Engineers, the equivalent of SEI, the Institution of Civil Engineers, the parallel to ASCE, and the Health and Safety Executive, which is comparable to OSHA. They provide our base funding and give overall support. Very importantly, we are independent of any commercial interest, and indeed independent of any external influence, even from the sponsors. As Glenn has said, CROSS was started 15 years ago and is now recognised as being trusted, competent, and authoritative. Whatever is reported, we never criticise anyone, and we encourage a no-blame culture. Reports are submitted on a voluntary basis, and provided there is no risk of names being revealed or punitive action being taken, contributors are quite content to do this. So how does it work? A report comes into the CROSS website about a concern or an occurrence. A concern is when a safety issue has been noted before construction, say a software problem. An occurrence is an event that has happened during construction or after a building is occupied, say the unsatisfactory behaviour of a structural member. The report is then de-identified by a designated person, of which there are only 2 in the UK. The now anonymised version is sent to our panel of independent experts for comments. These are added to the anonymised report, which, after a legal check, is published on the website. Significant reports are also published in newsletters, and very importantly, generic issues are highlighted in alerts. Then comes the most important part, bringing the reports to the attention of those who can influence safety. Success for safety systems is hard to measure, but we know that CROSS has helped to change the approach in parts of the construction industry, particularly amongst responsible designers and constructors. It is welcomed by building control bodies and other regulators, and has had a significant impact on professional institutions. It is well regarded by industry groups and is taught in some universities. We have influenced thinking in government departments over the years and are now influencing government policy on building safety. There's no doubt that CROSS has had a beneficial effect. Whilst it is some way from Glenn's single repository, it is a step along the way, and we are increasing the pace. Now for some examples of reports and subsequent alerts. An extreme case was the structure of a building that was to be a church, and hence needed a large column-free space in the centre. To achieve this, an unusual form was chosen, whereby the top 3 floors were suspended from a deep girder at roof level, spanning the width of the building. To achieve this, there were hangers and various tension components involved. One day, just after the frame was complete and precast floor planks were being positioned, 40 workers had just left the site when the structure collapsed, mainly due to defects in fabrication. It was a near miss, but the event could have been right at the top of the risk pyramid had the workers still been inside. Many near misses are matters of luck and good timing, and the difference between a near miss and a catastrophe can be wafer thin. This and other alerts on the website give advice on how to avoid the problems being discussed. Early one morning in 2016, during high winds, the external leaf of this gable wall of a school in Edinburgh collapsed, and 9 tons of masonry fell onto a path. Another near miss, because a few hours later the path would have been in use by parents and children. The extent of the failure can be seen here, the white shapes being insulation left attached to the inner leaf. It was a modern school, one of 17 built around the same time, and it was quickly found that all had inadequacies in the construction of their external walls. Wall ties were too short or were missing, wind posts had been omitted, and edge fixings to the main steel frame were insufficient. There was a public inquiry, and because of Cross's experience with defects in construction, we gave evidence. The findings of the inquiry show an entirely unacceptable situation with regard to critical life safety issues. Subsequently, many other buildings were found to be similarly affected. Systemic failure is always bad. Think Boeing. Reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete is different from normal dense concrete. It has no coarse aggregate and is made in factories using fine aggregate, chemicals to create gas bubbles, and heat to cure the compound. The composition is shown in the picture on the right. It is relatively weak, with a low capacity for developing bond with embedded reinforcement. It was used in the 1960s and 70s in structural units, such as roof planks. There was a Cross report in 2018 about the partial collapse of one such roof, shown on the left, and published in a newsletter. This led to several more reports, including descriptions of other collapses. It has now been found that there are very many schools, hospitals, and other institutional buildings with these roofs, and a special interest group has been set up to monitor the risks. Without the Cross reports, the problem might have remained undiscovered until a more serious collapse had occurred. Another near miss occurred in 2018 when a car on the 3rd floor of a crowded multi-story parking garage caught fire. The fire quickly spread to adjacent vehicles on the same floor, and then both upwards and downwards. Fire and rescue services were on the scene within a few minutes, but were unable to stop the blaze until almost 1,200 cars had been destroyed. Fortunately, the building had a substantial concrete frame, and whilst there was much damage and some local floor failures, there was no overall collapse. People in the garage escaped into stair courts which remained unaffected, a tribute to the fire door manufacturer. The fire load from closely parked cars is high, and there may be an increasing risk by having more electric vehicles whose batteries can burn fiercely. London has been the scene for 2 major safety events, one that shaped structural design concepts and one that is shaping fire design concepts. Glenn has already mentioned Ronan Point, which had worldwide repercussions on the robustness of structures and their sensitivity to uncontrolled collapse. Codes were changed, new design rules were adopted, and because the removal of a load-bearing element must not precipitate wholesale collapse, buildings now became safer. The second event was at Grenville Tower in 2017, when an uncontrollable fire attacked the cladding and 72 people died. The consequences will be with us for years, and it too will change safety practices worldwide. Grenville Tower was 40 years old, in need of refurbishment, and part of the project was to install external insulation. To protect the installation, there was an outer layer of aluminium composite panel, ACP cladding. Once ignited, the fire spread rapidly up the building. This is the scene approximately 1.5 hours after it started. One of the most important aspects of safety analysis is the identification of precursors, and there were several such events with the external cladding on tall buildings catching fire. Notable cases were the La Crosse Tower fire in Melbourne, Australia 2014, and the aptly named Torch Hotel fire in Dubai in 2016. There were others too. However, the link was not made that there could be many other buildings at risk from flammable cladding. Indeed, there are now concerns about fire risks from some types of high-pressure laminate cladding. The ongoing Grenville public inquiry, having examined what happened on the night and published its results, is now looking into the circumstances beyond the tragedy and the roles of those involved. This may be followed by criminal proceedings. Following the fire, Dame Judith Hackett addressed generic problems in construction and took evidence from many organisations in the industry, including us. Her report was entitled Building a Safety Future. The outcome in 2020 was new government legislation. This includes steps to be taken for improved building safety and improved fire safety. There is to be a new building safety regulator, and the system is to be supported by more cross-reporting and a new system for voluntary reporting on fire safety. The working title is CROFS, Confidential Reporting on Fire Safety. Both are huge steps forward for us, and to achieve them, we are being additionally funded by government. Mandatory reporting of certain life-critical issues will be introduced. This will go some way towards shining a light on practices that might be hidden by legal processes, a perennial problem. After 15 years and the unfortunate catalyst of the Grenville tragedy, CROSS is maturing and rapidly expanding. At present, there are immense changes to all of our activities due to the coronavirus. Sight must not be lost, however, of other risks, and it would be even more distressing if there were to be building failures because safety standards had slipped. Our designs, perhaps carried out from home, being given the checking scrutiny that is required. Is the level of inspection on site as diligent as it should be when there is a shortage of operatives and increased stress due to social distancing? To gauge the need for CROFS, meetings have been held with some 30 organisations representing all sectors of the UK fire community. There is unanimous support and approval for the system, which will, like CROFS, seek reports on concerns and occurrences. The rest of this year will be spent developing the system and processes, establishing a panel of experts, and setting up the website with a view to a launch early next year. There are interlinked benefits from the CROSS and CROFS processes. This is not just from the reports themselves, but from the analysis that follows. Most importantly, public safety is enhanced. The practice also benefits the duty holders, which is the term embracing those involved in the building cycle: owners, designers, constructors, and building managers. In the long run, there will be cultural change, which is assisted by confidential reporting. This, in turn, will be influenced by having good relationships with regulators, a yes situation, and the start of a better system of learning from the experiences of others. Lives, careers, and reputations can all be affected when lessons are not shared or are forgotten. Gravity affects us everywhere, and here are 3 examples of a common problem. In this case, the use of inappropriate chemical anchor adhesives. On the left is a tunnel in the UK where part of a suspended canopy came loose as resin-anchored bolts failed due to moisture ingress. A near miss as trains go through here at 100 miles an hour. In the US, there was the Boston Tunnel, where glued bolts came out of their sockets. In Japan, bolt fixing failures resulted in the deadly collapse of the lining of a tunnel and a subsequent fire. Lessons can be learned universally, so we need to explore the global outreach. As a result of congresses and conferences such as this, interest in what we do has extended to other countries, and the ambition is to have a worldwide network sharing the common goal of keeping people in buildings safe. First to join the UK was a group from Southern Africa, then a group from Australia, and it is hoped that New Zealand will be integrated too. In Germany, a parallel organisation is being formed. All reports will be on the database and freely available. Most important, of course, has been the formation of Cross US, and the immense strength of your nation and the construction sector means there are going to be many more experiences to be shared and life-saving lessons to be learned around the world. To describe how Cross US is contributing, I will hand over to Andy.
Good afternoon. I'm Andy Herman, and with Glenn Bell, I'm one of the directors of Cross US. Today, I'll present the last part of our Cross US presentation, which will describe how Cross works in the United States and share some examples of recent case reports from our first newsletter. First, a little history. After serving on both the I-Struck-E board in the UK and the SEI board in the United States, Glenn Bell saw the importance of Cross to structural safety in the UK and the need for it in the US. He worked with Alistair Sohn in his vision to make Cross international and advanced the formation of Cross within ASCE and SEI. Cross US was approved by the SEI Board of Governors in the spring of 2019. It prepared its first webpage and began receiving reports. Cross US reports to the SEI Board of Governors with an executive committee and a panel of experts. As you can see, the present members of the executive committee, there's 7, and our panel of experts, there's 12 right now, are up on the slide. We're also looking to expand our expert panel, and we're looking for representatives from consulting engineers, contractors, construction management, academics, government owners, private owners, code and standard setting organizations, building officials, members of the insurance industry, and legal and risk management counsel. The scope of issues considered are structural failures and collapses, or safety concerns about the design, construction, or use of structures. We're particularly interested in near misses or observations relating to failures or collapses, which have not been uncovered through formal investigation. Small-scale events are very important. They can be the precursors to more major failures. And in addition to non-newsmaking incidents that will typically be reported, we will from time to time draw on reports and materials that are available to the general public, for example, from NIST or NTSB reports. The type of structures considered are essentially any civil structure. We're looking at buildings, bridges, geotechnical, marine, and offshore, coastal dams, electrical transmission towers, industrial, and power. We're looking primarily in the United States, but anywhere in North America. In fact, we've actually received a report from Canada so far. We're not looking at mechanical machines, automotive, or aerospace. So how does Cross work? We have a diagram with 5 steps. Let me go through them. Number 1, a report is received by one of our directors, who then reviews it to see if it falls under our Cross requirements. If there is loss of life or legal implications, we recommend reporting to the government officials involved. 2, if accepted, the director processes the report to remove reporter, project, owner, and other identifying information from the report, and then sends the depersonalized and de-identified report to the expert panel. Number 3, the expert panel analyzes the incident, adds comments and possibly recommendations to the report. 4, after summarizing the comments and re-reviewing the report, it is published, added to the database, and provided to the profession. But just prior to publishing the report, the base report received from the reporter is purged from our databases. Last, number 5, through this process, we hope to educate the industry, prevent future incidents, and influence change while maintaining confidentiality of the initial reporter. Confidentiality is most important to Cross. A confidential system allows safety issues to be reported without creating concerns in areas like co-worker relations, client loyalty, legal, or insurance. Cross is a no-blame culture. The reporter's personal information and any identifiable details, such as a project, product, individual, or organization, are completely confidential to Cross and are not shared with anyone. So let's go to our website. As I mentioned earlier, the Cross US website went live in the summer of 2019, and it is linked to the webpage of Cross International. This is a recent screenshot of the web page, and on the left you can see reports, alerts, topic papers, newsletters, and selected media citations. On the top right, you can search the database, not only of Cross US, but also the other Cross partners worldwide. The next two red arrows on the right are very important. You can sign up for email updates, and you can submit a report online. Okay, I'm going to do something a little bit different now, something speakers hardly ever do. I'm going to ask you to take out your phones right now. Take out your phones, turn on your browsers, and I want you to download the website, www.cross-us.org. So let's just wait a second. Take out that iPhone, take out that Android phone, download the website, because this is something where once you have that website down, you can look at that red box on the screen and you can put your name and your email address in. And once you do that and submit it, and it's accepted by Cross, you can now receive the quarterly newsletters, the Cross reports, alerts, and topic papers. So let's go back to that Cross US website. In the red box on the slide, there's a section to provide initial reports. Using this icon brings you to the How to Submit Reports page. There's even an area to look at sample reports for submission ideas and formats. This is the slide you get on when you hit that icon. And initially it asks for reporter information, but this is only seen by a Cross director and used to clarify information. That's if something comes up with a question from the director who needs to get back to the reporter to clarify something. So before a report goes live, reporter information is purged from the system. So we go a little further down the How to Report webpage. We see incident-specific information requested, such as report type, description of the event or concern. If there was a failure, then the cause of the failure if known. It also looks for downloading supporting files, drawings, sketches, and photographs. It looks for lessons that could be learned and structure information. We try to make it very easy to submit a report, including sample reports, to show how to put one together. If you don't want to do it online, we even have a way with secure mail to send in a report. We are very proud to announce that the first Cross US newsletter was published online in March of 2020, and it contained 5 reports which demonstrate the breadth of Cross's use and value. What I'd like to do now is give a quick highlight of each report and direct you to the newsletter for further details. The first report involves the partial collapse of a roof of a 1-story masonry building in California during a 2019 earthquake. The building structure has concrete masonry walls with roof trusses of wood cords and steel diagonals. There was a seismic foreshock the day before the collapse event. In this failure, the roof trusses separated from the bearing walls and the roof collapsed onto the ground floor. The reporter indicated that the truss bearing failure appeared to be from cross-grain tension failure of the timber ledger at the truss bearing wall connection, as illustrated on the slide. Comments and references to code requirements are included. In the second report, the reporter notes concerns raised by 2 tower crane collapses in 2019 during dismantling, one in the UK and one in the United States. Both the Cross UK and the Cross US panels collaborated on this report. The report addresses background on each collapse with comments on past failures and factors that affect tower crane safety. The third report concerns the use of standoff brackets with C-shaped cornice hooks for scaffolding support. Commentary describes the use, banning of the use in a major U.S. city, and safety codes covering the use of these brackets. The fourth report involves a building collapse caused by inappropriate stockpiling of construction debris during a re-roofing operation. This was not a newsmaking collapse, and the lessons learned might not otherwise be brought to light if not for the existence of cross. The stockpiled construction debris along the low side of the roof acted as a dam, leading to a ponding stability collapse of the roof framing at the lowermost bay. Comments that cover the duties of the engineer and the contractor. The last report is a retrospective look at a legacy failure, the catastrophic roof collapse of the Hartford Coliseum in 1978. While processing of legacy failures for which public information exists was not the primary motivation for establishing CROSS, we must not forget past lessons learned. The concerns over computer software and modeling errors raised by this case are very much relevant today. So where do we go from here? Right now, CROSS US is receiving and evaluating reports as they are submitted. We're also looking to other legacy failures to not forget the lessons learned from the past. And we're looking to current reports on failures, such as the National Transportation Safety Board report on the FIU bridge collapse, to publicize their findings and their recommendations. So how can you help? Well, hopefully you've already done it, but you can sign up for the www.cross-us.org website. We need you to get connected so that you receive the newsletters and the alerts. We also need you to spread the word about CROSS US. Until more engineers and contractors and members of our community know about CROSS, we can't start getting more reports and putting out more failures on our website. We need you to submit reports. Every engineer throughout their career has seen problems on job sites, failures, areas that could lead to failures. We want you to dig back in some of that memory and submit reports. We also want you to encourage others to submit reports. And lastly, as you see on our expert panel, we're asking you to volunteer your expertise to CROSS US. We've given you the categories we're looking for, and we're looking for people to volunteer to send that, to use that expertise with us. At this point, I'm going to turn the session back to Glenn Bell for questions. Thank you.
Great. We have a lot of questions from our viewers, so let's get at it. One administrative request before we do. We are experiencing an overload on the Zoom chat. That's a good thing. A lot of you are participating. There is an alternative that you can use if you have trouble with the Zoom chat, which is to use YouTube Zoom. And if you want to do that, hover your mouse over any place of your video screen. You'll see a box light up in your lower right-hand corner that says YouTube. If you click on that, you'll have access to YouTube chat. Okay. Our first question is for Alistair Sohn. Alistair, you've been working intensely with the CROSS system for the last 15 years, processing reports, undoubtedly learned a lot of tremendous lessons of your own. Could you summarize what your top takeaways have been over the years about the general causes of failures and safety problems in structures?
Well, thank you, Glenn. That's a challenging question because we've got about 1,000 cases to think about. But they fall into three main categories. There are design issues, there are construction issues, and there are events which happen during the lifetime of a building while it's in use. In design, we find there are errors in some of the most basic issues. For example, lack of stability. We find people who do not follow codes, people who do not follow regulations, and also there are some issues where there is no engineering input at all. A fairly simple case such as unreinforced masonry walls falling over, but they kill quite a lot of children, but there's no engineering in them at all. We also find more sophisticated failures, such as the lack of verification of software, where software is used by one of the generations, which we were talking about earlier, who simply assume that if you put the numbers in, the right numbers will come out. And that's not necessarily the case. So we have lack of verification, lack of validation on software, creating computer-aided problems. On sites, there is a failure to supervise workmanship, a failure of workmanship itself. There are also issues to do with inspection. And the lack of inspection often on building sites now caused by money saving by clients results in inspections not being made and defects being hidden and sometimes covered up before they are revealed. We've also found that there are generic lessons, such as I mentioned earlier, the Edinburgh schools, and they of course are particularly severe because when you make one small mistake and it's repeated many times, the effects are very substantial indeed.
Great.
As far as buildings in use are concerned, we have problems with maintenance. And one of the biggest ones, I guess, is where unauthorized changes have been made, either by a contractor or by an owner. And these have not been authorized by the designer, and they invalidate the design concepts. I think the most overriding causes of failure are trying to cut corners, trying to reduce money, and going for the cheapest option, whether it's in design, in construction, or in use.
Very good. There's a lot to unpack there. Thank you very much. Andy, this next one is for you. How much work does it take to submit a cross report? Can you describe the procedures? Doesn't it require a lot of data, extensive? And if it takes a lot of time, how do we encourage people to submit reports?
As I showed on the presentation, you can go right to our www.cross-us.org website, and you hit the button on the right side of the screen to submit a report, and up will pop the area that you just have to fill in the boxes, essentially. But you can also add photographs, sketches, diagrams, plans, if you will, to that. There's a place where you can actually download them to the site. It basically leads you through the submitting of a report, and you can actually look at some sample reports if you want to figure out how other people did it.
Great. Very good. And I might add to that it doesn't have to be highly polished information. We have a very eager and a willing group of panel experts to work with data and produce very polished live reports. So in many respects, we can do the heavy lifting, right?
Yes.
Great. This question is, I think, probably for both of you. You can take it in the order you like. Can you give examples of how individuals and engineering companies can learn from CROSS as individuals and organizationally? What does that look like?
Alistair, you want me to shoot first?
Yes.
Okay. You could actually have the session, reports as part of a job meeting or a lunch learning session at your firm if you wanted to, and use them as examples and try to get everybody to get those lessons learned out.
Very good. Alistair?
Well, designers can use the information because it enables them to check for safety issues when they're going through a design, things they may not have thought about. So they can use the database for checking for concerns. On site, it can be used very effectively in order to help educate people at all levels, from the shop floor to the managing director. And some of the best feedback we get is from construction sites where they say, by reading your newsletters, we have avoided problems which otherwise we might have fallen into traps with.
Great. Thank you. Great. This question also is, I think, for both of you, because we probably need a UK and a US perspective on this. But I'd suggest we start with Alistair. How does the litigation system in your country affect an individual's willingness to report on structural safety? Confidentially usually only goes so far, even though professional ethics issues require one to submit issues on ethics to deal with them?
We have not had any problems with legal issues. The confidentiality aspect of it is extremely important. We never reveal the names of reporters, we never reveal the names of sites or products used, and we don't blame people. So we do not deal with ongoing legal cases. That would be beyond our remit. So all the reports that we have are to do with things which have not involved litigation. All the litigation has been and gone. So by making sure that we stick to the confidentiality rules and that we give sound advice, then we don't have problems.
Just one follow-on before we move to Andy. Have you ever had a circumstance in 15 years where you were somehow impelled by a legal process, subpoena or something, to reveal confidential information?
No, we've never been asked that question. It doesn't mean it won't happen, and we have got steps in place, including legal checks before we publish anything, but it has not happened to us in 15 years.
Great. Very good. Andy, of course, we don't have the same track record in the US that they have in the UK, but how would you respond to the question?
We do have, when we do put out reports, even before it goes to our expert panel, it's depersonalized and de-identified. And before it actually gets published, we purge all the original reports, which have the reference to the reporter, from our database. So we don't have an electronic record of it at that point when it's actually reported.
Yeah. So I think we would all remind our viewers, and you both showed in your presentations the pyramid of risk, that the focus on CROSS is on the lesser failures. We're not envisioning producing reports, processing reports on fatalities, newsmaking failures, and those sorts of things that get tied up in courts for years. We have learned, and in fact, the aviation safety reporting system in the US, which is based on this, that we can learn so much, if not more, from the lesser incidents, the near misses, and general safety concerns. So that's really our focus, not the stuff that gets tied up in courts for years. Great.
Yep.
We have several questions around Cross International. I'll start with a broad one, Alistair. I know that I can tell the viewers that Cross International is your brainchild, your goal, your vision. And you talked a little bit about it, about the shorter term progress of it, where it might go from here, but longer term, what would you love to see Cross International become? What would it look like? And speak some more to the benefits of a truly global network.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you to whoever asked that question. The effect of gravity, the effect of physics, the rules of life, the rules related to money apply universally. So the problems we are all faced, both as engineers and as guardians of public safety, are the same. By the interconnections we've built so far with Australasia, with Southern Africa, and now with you in the US, we have proved that experiences can be shared and that reporters' comments can be shared. So we are building up a repository of information which has concerns and has got solutions. It is likely that for the next few years, the organizations which join the family will come from the developed world. But the ultimate goal is that in developing countries, particularly those areas of the world where there's going to be huge investment and huge development over the remaining part of this century, that there is there for them a completely free resource whereby people designing and people building these cities of the future can utilize the information which has been built up by our forebears and our present generation at some considerable cost. And we want to make it available internationally.
Very nice. Thank you. This follow-on question is for the both of you, and it relates to Crossfire and its perhaps proliferation in the future. Andy, do we envision ever producing a cross-fire entity in the US like they are moving towards in the UK? And Alistair, do you see an international network of cross-fire entities someday?
Well, Glenn, we haven't really pursued it yet, but it's something to look forward to in the future. I mean, as Alistair develops it in the UK, we can find parallels in the United States, and hopefully we can learn from them.
Alistair?
Yes, if I can add to that, more people are killed and seriously injured in fires than they are in structural failures.
Right.
Fire is a bigger threat to our communities, and it's one which will benefit, we believe, from having a confidential reporting system, because there are many different ways of looking at fire situations, and there's a range of people involved, from fire engineers through to fire and rescue fighters. If their experiences can be brought to bear and we can produce information of high caliber, then I think there is an international use for it. And as issues such as climate change make fires more difficult to control and if they occur more often, hopefully we will be able to make a difference.
Great, thank you. We're getting follow-up questions on some topics we've already addressed. A couple more on international. The first of these probably is directed to Alistair. Is there a protocol for a country to join the international network, or is it up to their initiative?
It must start with initiative from the country, but there is a protocol. We are looking, first of all, for organizations which are independent of commercial entities, and that can provide a high quality of engineering background, such as SEI or iStructE in the UK. And as long as they can meet those criteria, then we are very willing and open to talk to people. They can go onto the structural safety website, and if you look up structural safety in any of the big search engines, it comes up in the top 2 or 3. And they can send me an email, and I'll be delighted to talk to them and take it from there.
Great. And one more follow-up question internationally. We have a viewer who would be interested to submit a report from Pakistan. Is that possible?
Certainly, they can submit it again by going to the structural safety website. We have had, over the years, quite a lot of reports from various parts of the world. They are very valuable. You can't tell where they come from because we de-identify them. But the problems are the same, whether it's in Pakistan or whether it's in the UK or the US.
Right. Okay. I'll direct this next one to Andy. How can a young engineer benefit from Cross-US?
Well, one of the best places to learn and develop your engineering experiences, unfortunately, is through failures. So it's a lot better to do it through other people's failures than your own failures. So Cross has lessons learned from things that went wrong on many, many jobs or precursors that could lead to failures. So just studying the reports are a great way to gain experience.
Very good. Thank you.
If I can add to that, Glenn, in the UK, the professional institutions are regarding Cross as part of continuing professional development. So graduate engineers are encouraged to study the reports and maybe question about them during their professional interviews.
Great. Thank you. This next question is directed to Alistair, but I suspect that Andy has thoughts and can weigh on this too. It notes that in your remarks, Alistair, you talked about reliance of software. And the question is, if we can't rely on software, how will we be able to design very complex, multi-degree of freedom, complicated structures, particularly for high seismic areas?
Well, that's a question for more than this discussion, isn't it? It's a perennial question. And those of us from the boomer years would say, well, you should do rough calculations on the back of an envelope. But that is still the case, that the engineer should know approximately what the solutions are going to be. Very complicated structures with very complicated transfers and complicated dynamics in terms of seismic zones. Of course, they do benefit enormously from having the correct software. but there is a lot to be said for standing back and making sure that the software is giving the sort of answers that a good engineer would think are appropriate.
Very good. Andy, I'm sure you have thoughts on that.
Well, definitely, you have to put the right information into the software programs. You have to have confidence in the software programs. You also have to know the structure. And when it's complicated, sometimes you have to use more than one software program to check another, just to get different approaches to it.
Yeah. So I would add, I think it's sort of a high-level answer to your question is that it's not that we can't rely on software, it's that we can't over-rely or misuse software. And many of the comments that Alistair and Andy have made are valid. I have a lot of experience with this in my own practice and having run a structural firm for many years. Use of software as a tool. It can be used or it can be misused. The software itself has to be validated. The input has to be correct. There are many checks that you can do, basic checks of statics and deflected shapes and so forth to test whether the information that's coming out the back end makes sense or not. And this is absolutely critical. Software does have its place, but it has a proper use and can be misused. Great. Here is another question, interesting one that I haven't pondered before. Have you ever had a case where everything was done based on code and still resulted in some issue? And I'm curious to see if reports have been contributed to improvement in codes. Again, for both of you.
It's important, I think, to remember that codes often set the lowest standards. That doesn't mean to say they're poor standards or bad standards, but they're the standards which are the minimum for a safe design. And sometimes you can get codes which go, or structures which go beyond the code standards which exist. So no, I can't think of a building which is complied in every respect with a code which is not right in structural terms, but in fire terms, that is possibly the case. And certainly in the UK, we're seeing revisions to fire codes now, which is an important development. And have we influenced codes? We certainly know that our information is read by code committees, and we have contributed to a number of safety related publications which are referred to in codes. So yes, we have had an influence over the longer term.
Great. And this is going to be our last answer to the last question. So Andy, you have a relatively brief addendum to what Alistair has said.
Yes. Codes are always expanding. They're changing based on our knowledge and our experiences. I sit on one of the codes for railroad structures, for steel structures, and we're always looking at the codes and trying to update them. So they move forward as we learn more.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you all out there who contributed great questions. We haven't had time to address them all, but we are thinking about a follow-up plan for maybe processing your questions and getting the answers out there in a different forum later on. I will say Andy asked everyone to sign up for email alerts. I actually get an email ping every time one of those happens into the cross system. And there was a flood of them coming in. So thank you for those who signed up. But I didn't get as many email alerts as I know there are people out there listening. So the rest of you, please sign up. So with that, we'll move on. We're going to take a 10-minute break before our third session. Hello again. Now I'd like to introduce Don Dusenberry on Performance-Based Design is the Future. Don joined Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager in 1975 and serves as a consulting principal. He's led numerous complex investigations, analyses, and peer reviews of buildings, bridges, and other structures. He has extensive experience in investigations of failed civil and mechanical structures. Don is an active participant in many professional organizations and is a former president of SEI. He currently chairs the SEI committee that is developing a path to advance the profession from prescriptive to performance-based design practice. Don has written extensively on failure investigations and topics such as structural performance under extreme events, including blast, fire, and disproportionate collapse. Following the presentation, there will be a final live chat Q&A with Don. Submit your questions anytime during or after the presentation, during the event or YouTube chat boxes on your screen.
Thank you, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a long time since I have missed the Structures Congress, but of course, under the circumstances, we're doing the right thing. I'm very happy to be part of our video version of the Structures Congress, where I'll speak about performance-based engineering. Clearly, I'm not going to be teaching you about performance-based engineering, but I do intend to present some slides that create an argument that we should be moving in that direction. And hopefully at the end, we'll have some discussion about it and add some clarity to the matter. So at any rate, thank you very much. We'll get started. The topic of my presentation today is performance-based design is the future. This is an interesting topic for me because I've spent a large portion of my career contributing to developing prescriptive codes. I've been involved with ASCE 7 since the late 80s. So now I'll spend probably the rest of my career working to dismantle a lot of what I have been doing in the past. The inspiration for this actually comes from work I did for SEI earlier in the 2000s. In 2013, we prepared this report on the vision of the future of structural engineering. It was an interesting exercise because we spent a lot of time thinking about things that are coming our way and things that might influence our profession, how we might be better prepared for it. So interestingly enough, you can take a look at this if these matters are interesting to you. The easy way to get there is to navigate through the SEI Futures Fund page at the ASCE SEI website. And of course, the Futures Fund page is a good place to spend a little time too. So part of what came out of that was identification of some of the relevant influences that are going to impact, are presently impacting, and going to impact our profession. And among those that are relevant to the issue here at hand are technology and codes and standards. So let's talk first a little bit about technology to see what that's doing to our profession and how we might tap into technology to do bigger and better things. And of course, technology is not just computers and phones. These are the things, I suppose, that we have on our hands every day and we think about all the time. But our profession has much more at hand. We have all sorts of tools for field investigation, for analysis of data, for interpretation of performance of structures that are in place. And from these things, we can learn and expand our capabilities. And you think about how this is changing our profession over the years, and there are impacts that are potentially concerning. For instance, if we look at what drafting used to be and what drafting is now, there is a far more efficient process in place, and work can be done by far fewer people. The same is true for engineering. Engineering is very person-intensive. It's an intellectual exercise and involves a lot of people, but as our technology improves, of course, each of us can do more than we could before. So you wonder, what does that mean to us? What's happening to our profession? Now, if I look a bit back at my own experience when I joined Simpson Gumpertson Hager, it was a very different company than it is now, of course, and it's a couple decades ago. But at any rate, at the time, if I looked at the workforce at that time, it was nearly 20% drafters and word processors. The rest were other type of people serving other purposes, and of course, the engineering staff. If I look at it now, the number of drafters and word processors has diminished to something on the order of 6% of our workforce. And that's because they have become more efficient, and indeed, engineers are doing some of the tasks that drafters and word processors used to do. So you might wonder, again, about our workforce. What's going to happen to our workforce? Is this a threat? If we look further, we can imagine that our designs are becoming more automated. We can do very sophisticated analyses and make changes rapidly. And at some point, you can imagine that an architect with very little support of an engineer could be setting up models of structures, analyzing them, drag and drop column locations, and that sort of thing, and ultimately diminish the role that a structural engineer has in the process. How far are we from an analysis, producing drawings, going to a fabrication shop, and having very little input from an engineer? In fact, maybe the day will come where we won't have drawings. We'll go from analyses, software to the fab shop where parts will be cut and holes will be punched and that sort of thing. So is it a threat or is it an opportunity? Well, clearly it's an opportunity. We should be considering an opportunity. First of all, we're going to remove the drudgery, some of the drudgery. I recall as a young engineer doing very lengthy hand calculations and wishing I didn't have to, and getting very good at doing them because I didn't want to do them twice. I wanted to have the intuition necessary to get the answers right the first time. So at any rate, that will be diminished. And in addition to that, we have now the opportunity to do many more analyses to optimize our designs and clearly also to perform a higher level of engineering. We don't have to be confined to basic calculations. We can do very sophisticated things now. And all of this allows us to provide a better work product to our clients and society. We have tools. We can use them. Now let's look at codes and standards a bit. You might argue, well, the more comprehensive, the better. We'll have better structures. Is that really what we think? Is that really the way it's going to play out? I'm not so sure. But if you look at ASCE 7, which again, I've been a part of now for most of what you see there, the number of pages has increased over the years. Back in the 80s, it was less than 100 pages long, the equivalent document. And now it's getting up very high. And I suppose 2022 is yet to be seen, but I wouldn't be surprised if the number of pages gets up higher even than that. And if we look at what the content is, it's text, it's tables, maps, and calculations, and formulas, rather. And while these things may look rather daunting, that on itself is a problem, I suppose, for many engineers. But you have to admit that everything that's in that book can and will be programmed eventually and run with very little direct input from the engineer. At least it's possible. So is this a problem? It may be, or maybe it's not. Maybe what the complexity that's created in a standard now seems like a problem. Eventually, it may be something that we don't have to concern ourselves with. But is that what we want to do? The bottom line is that our codes and standards today are very prescriptive. They tell us what to do. They set our priorities. They limit how we solve our problems. And by doing all of those things, they stifle innovation and creativity. So how did we get here? Why are we this way now when perhaps we could have gone a different path? Well, part of it has to do with how codes are developed. Over the years, typically, safety has been the primary focus, and of course, that's our primary goal, is to make certain that the things that we design are safe. And sometimes codes develop as a result of a large loss. There's been some kind of an event, creates a circumstance, an interest in the engineering profession about what happened and why it is that we need to change our code, or if we need to change our code, and we do so. And sometimes it follows a breakthrough in research. Research is underway all the time. Somebody learns something new, and wants to bring it into the code so that we are doing our designs according to the best current information. But rarely do these things happen with a broad look at the entire picture. Are we really considering, when we make a change to the code, what the implications are across the board? If we make a change in one place, does it have for an improvement? Does it have a negative impact somewhere else? Not always are these things considered in full depth. Now, over the decades, in spite of the fact that we are interested very much in life safety, we are getting more and more involved in our codes into other matters: economic loss, serviceability, sustainability, robustness, and these things are entering our code and our guidance, but they're not usually linked to any expectation of an expression of reliability or to levels of risk. They are not consistently handled, nor is the issue of life safety consistently handled when it comes to reliability. So what do we get? Over the course of code development, we rarely get meaningful attempts to remove regulations. We tend to add things in, but not necessarily take things out. Sometimes we are driven by major events. We react. We don't necessarily contemplate in all aspects what the implications of a change might be. Sometimes we develop our changes for specific conditions. We've learned something new about the way a concrete beam behaves, so we make a change. But it may have wider implications and work contrary to other goals. In that context, we don't always consider what the implications are across the spectrum of things that are considered in our designs: serviceability versus life safety. And sometimes we just simply get an idea that's good, and we think that everybody ought to do it that way because it works for me. And sometimes these things actually make their way into code, standards, and other guidance. The bottom line is codes are becoming increasingly prescriptive. So why are we even comfortable with this? How did we get to this situation where we are operating in this sphere and feel that this is the right way to be working? Well, you know, if we go back 100 years or more, we can talk about what the industry was like then. And at that time, of course, we had a very different system of operation. Builders were designers. The engineers, the contractors were one entity. And architects were engineers. There was not a separation often between those disciplines. And we did all of that without prescriptive codes. At the time, somehow, somebody figured out the way to solve engineering problems without having to follow prescriptive codes. And within our own profession, civil engineering wasn't subdivided previously, but now we have our boxes. For some reason, at some point, we decided to start defining boxes, whether we were builders or designers or architects or structural engineers, geotechnical engineers, we defined our boxes. And I ask, why is that? Why? Are we afraid of innovation? Was there a time that we started to feel like we couldn't trust ourselves and that we needed to be in a little box and we needed to be told how to do our work? Is that where we have gotten? And are we not better than that? And then the following question, of course, is, are we hiding behind our codes? Do we use the code as protection rather than a tool? If we follow the code, we're being good engineers and we won't be criticized. But if that happens, if that's what we're doing, what are we actually getting for it? our analyses that we do don't necessarily tell us how the structure is actually going to perform. You never really know. You design something, the structure gets built, nobody calls you up and says it isn't working right, so you don't know. You don't know if it's over-designed, under-designed, you don't know what. I've said it many times, I know other people say it too. You learn more about structural performance by looking at one that hasn't done well than you do by designing 10 that work just fine. So what are we doing? Are we really designing efficient structures? Codes force us to some solutions, and that sometimes gets us into trouble. And in fact, sometimes litigation hinges on some minutia related to code compliance. And it's not right when that happens. If you cross a little line someplace and all of a sudden you're getting criticized, even though the performance of the structure seems to be fine. So here we are, given our litigious culture and our overall responsibility for life safety, of course, have we forgotten how to deal with risk evaluations, or are we unable? And are we now comfortable with the cookbook solutions that we get by our codes? Is that where we are? Are we wasting our abilities? We're better than that, of course. And is society getting the best of our talents? We can do so much more than just follow cookbook solutions. So should we do better? I think, of course, we should. So here we are. What is it that we're not dealing with properly? First of all, we should use technology to advance our profession, to provide more abilities to provide service to our clients and to society, rather than using it to replace our abilities and our thought processes and automate it in a way that we don't understand often. And if you look at our codes and standards, perhaps they've become a crutch, but they certainly have stymied innovation. When we have prescriptive codes that don't allow us to be more creative, we are boxed into certain solutions that may not be the best that we can provide to our clients. So where do we go from here? What do we do with the situation that we have today? Well, I'll say, first of all, of course, our technical skills will always be our strong suit. We are getting into a world, of course, where technical skills need to be balanced more by the power skills as we interact more with clients and society and related stakeholders. We are finding perhaps that less of our time is on technical matters, and that's because of automation. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It is, though, if our skills are exceed what we are allowed to do. So in the future, and now, of course, our technical skills will evolve into things that are less number crunching and more intuitive and forward-looking. Synthesizing, condensing vast amounts of information, conceptual engineering fundamentals will be key. Our intuition, learning how structures perform, and doing that without running multiple computer analyses that we really don't understand. And ultimately, we have to leverage this technology to its greatest benefit. So technology needs to be a tool to enhance our designs, not a replacement for our skills. We have to turn our abilities toward overall enhancement of the total project, less focused on the number crunching and the details of code provisions. And we're going to need to be creative and exercise curiosity to be lead contributors to the construction industry. Bottom line, we need to be using our brains rather than our fingertips. And we need to step out of the boxes that we have created for ourselves. We have more to give, and we should be attempting to do so. We need to be liberated. We need to have the ability to assess and manage risk, to create reliability. And with all of that comes rewards, certainly for the owner, a better structure, more cost efficient, more material efficient, for ourselves as the designer, financial and intellectual reward, and of course for overall society, reliability. Better sets of structures that will better deal with resilience and sustainability and maintaining a long life. All of these things can be enhanced if we liberate ourselves and apply our skills in a broader sphere. So we need to take on more responsibility if we want to keep our profession vibrant, exciting, and a contributor to the overall good of society. It's all about innovation, leadership, and rising to our full potential. We have more to give, and we should be doing that. And we should be promoting performance-based engineering as a means to better serve society. That Case for Change report that I showed you in one of the very first slides has a statement in it that I think is useful to be considering at this point. It says, if we mandate how a structure must perform, but leave freedom to how the engineer provides that performance, we open the possibilities for amazing solutions to presently unsolvable problems. This is a mandate, I think, that we should be considering as we're talking about performance-based engineering. All right, let's talk a little more, therefore, about what is a performance-based code and how does it differ from what we have today. So you can do this, you can make a kind of a statement like this, which I don't take seriously, but let's say it anyway. When subjected to the environment, the structure shall not fall down, vibrate too much, deteriorate too fast, or be too hard to repair or repurpose. Well, that sounds very general and maybe a good goal, but it really isn't where we are with a performance-based code. Instead, performance-based codes establish the acceptance criteria. What are we expecting this structure to do? They allow for development of threshold design bases. They provide guidance about how to perform analyses, and they set expectations for the verification of the accuracy. What they don't do is prescribe requirements, dictate analyses, or mandate one answer to a problem. Let's get a little more serious about what the statement is, and it goes more like this. The building shall perform as expected when subjected to hazards defined in advance. Clearly, the code is a concept that we're talking about. And if we look a little bit about what this might mean in the code, let's look a bit back to where the Euro codes took a step. There are statements like this in the older Euro codes. The structure shall be designed such that deterioration over its design working life does not impair the performance. That doesn't tell you how to do it, but it tells you what the goal is. To take another example from the Euro codes, it talks about the design working life, and it gives those lives in terms of years and does give examples of the types of structures that are expected to be in that category. You might call this a parallel to the performance categories in ASCE 7. But there is a difference in the case here that we're talking about design life, not simply loads, which I think is what you see mostly in ASCE 7 these days. So performance-based design is based on stated goals and objectives, which are validated through analyses, tests, or a combination thereof. It explicitly, and this is an important difference, It explicitly evaluates how a building will perform in response to the hazards, as opposed to simply taking loads and making certain that the elements are not overstressed. We're looking at the building performance and the specific evaluation of that performance. So performance-based codes contain essential requirements for comprehensive design, and they provide a framework for determining levels of safety and property protection. It provides for hazard types and severity levels, and it describes alternatives for performance expectations. Then you assess the performance directly through the code. Codes of performance-based codes likely will endorse methodologies, set minimum standards for what types of procedures should be used, focus on system performance over element performance, and for quality control and important structures, it's likely that we will have peer reviews. The reason for that, of course, is that with less prescribed, more judgment and creativity are allowed, and in that context, having a peer review is a way to validate designs that are created through performance-based codes. So the benefits that we are likely to get. Performance-based codes facilitate early introduction of new technology. They allow for innovation. An important part is that it allows realistic evaluation of performance and, in fact, losses that might be expected should there be an event that reaches the design base. Performance-based codes can be used to verify equivalence of different approaches. They can raise efficiency, foster sustainability, because we're not constrained to a single way to solve a problem. We have flexibility. And it creates transparency. We can talk with our clients about levels of expectation that they should or could maintain and get their input on those matters. So performance-based codes will foster in having informed stakeholders. Everyone will understand what the goals are and how we're going to meet them. It fosters communication about risk acceptance and performance expectations. Owners will better understand that in a seismic event, there's going to be damage, and that damage is part of the design. Often we don't have that conversation the way we should, and owners sometimes are surprised when they have that kind of performance. This will foster that kind of communication. We'll have better techniques for understanding, establishing reliability. We'll have a more uniformity in reliability. The likelihood of a damage occurring during a snowstorm will be comparable at the design base to the likely damage due to a windstorm at the design base, so that we have consistent reliability with performance-based codes. We'll have a methodology for converting risk assessments into design parameters. Through this process and through the analyses that are engaged, we'll have better confidence in the outcome of what we are producing. You know, this isn't something that's new to the engineering profession at all. In fact, we may be one of the few disciplines that has done what we have done to ourselves by creating prescriptive codes. Mechanical engineers, they don't have prescriptive codes. Electrical engineers, and our collaborators, geotechnical engineers, they're not engaged in the type of prescriptive design that we as structural engineers do. And it's because we have written our codes in a way that does constrain us. So we're not really charting new waters. And in fact, even within our structural engineering profession, this is not an entirely new concept. For some time now, there have been performance-based provisions for seismic design. ASCE 716 has the new Appendix E which talks about and lays out a process for performance-based design of structural response to fire. So these are not new. This isn't something that's totally out of the realm of what structural engineers are doing. In fact, there are some who practice very heavily in this area. And wind is on the way. Studies and development is in process right now to put a performance-based provision together for wind design. So we have it already. So what are the steps? Let's talk a bit about the steps in the process. How does one go about a design using performance-based codes? The matters include these, and perhaps some others. First, we want to understand what are the hazard scenarios? What are the influences on our structure that we need to design for? And what are the objectives? For one windstorm, we may want the cladding to sustain no damage whatsoever. And another windstorm, we may allow some damage, but we don't want the cladding to fall off the building. There may be different levels of performance for different hazard scenarios, and we can map those to each other. We develop the performance criteria. How do we measure the performance? What is going to constitute the threshold at which we say the design isn't meeting the criteria? And we have then finally, and interwoven actually, we have the process of verifying that the performance meets the objectives. And of course, hazard types can be the ones we usually see. We think of them as loads, but they are the hazards that impact the structure. There may be others as well, but these are key to what we are used to doing and dealing with. And we'll probably have different return periods, different intensity levels that map against different performance expectations. And those performance expectations, in many cases, can map into a list like this. These are the objectives. We want to prevent, we want to perhaps collapse is permissible under certain circumstances, or we may want to be on the verge of collapse, preventing collapse, life safety, immediate occupancy, and operational performance, which would be the highest, meaning that the structure continues to operate throughout an event. There may be others as well. There will be others as well. The serviceability limits that we would want to map against. Occupant comfort, stiffness, which may be related to how a process can be supported inside of a building. Downtime, should there be a loss, repairability, ability to repurpose the structure, should the need arise in the future. These all can be mapped into performance-based codes in a way that they can't go into prescriptive codes. So let's look at some examples of some of the criteria that we might be dealing with. For seismic design, we might start off with a premise like this. Structures should have less than a 10% chance of collapse given the occurrence of the maximum considered earthquake. If we look at human comfort, we might say no more than one event in 10 years should cause swaying, trembling to occupants. Or in response to fire, no portion of the structure should collapse during a full burnout fire. These could be the premise in each case that we establish to set the expectations for the performance. How do we go about doing these, responding to this? Well, we have resources that we would bring to bear. For instance, for that seismic case, we have an understanding of ground shaking that's associated with each return period for seismic events. We have understandings of characteristics about human comfort in response to vibrations. And we have information on fire loads, how much heat is generated when a fire occurs in a building of a certain occupancy. And we have understanding about the impact of temperature on structural materials. With that information, we can do our analyses. Seismic, maybe it's a non-linear dynamic analysis. Human comfort, vibration analyses, as opposed to perhaps simply a stiffness level that one might put into a prescriptive code now. And for structural response to fire, we take those fire loads, calculate temperatures in the structural elements, and determine the loads that are generated on the structural frame as a result, and the changes in the properties of the materials while they're under load and after. So it's the analyses that follow. The map may look something like this, the flow chart. We identify the hazards, we select the performance objectives, and this is a process that involves all the stakeholders. We develop a design that we think may respond to those hazards and performance expectations, and we test against a criteria that we would have to measure our performance. If we make it, the design is complete. And if we don't, we go through the usual process of revising the design and repeating the assessment process. So it's a flow chart that has similarities to what you do in a prescriptive approach, those last few boxes, but it's the lead-in boxes that are different. And the process by which we prove performance, verify performance, is somewhat different. Beyond that, we can have other algorithms. We can measure other performance objectives that we don't normally do as structural engineers now. It is possible to consider mapping structural failure against casualties, repair costs, and not just the structural repair costs, but other types of repair costs. How long a structure might be down if it has a certain kind of damage as a result of an agreed upon event and a performance expectation. And we can be considering the impact on resilience across the community. These things can be tapped into a performance-based code approach. So the outcome, we have better informed stakeholders. We have a uniform handling of risk and performance expectations. We get structures that are efficient, reliable, and balance competing needs. And we have a new and enhanced role for structural engineers. Now, if we look a bit back now at the prescriptive design, just to hammer home the differences. It is a design that's based on prescribed parameters governing materials, design processes, and construction methods. Prescriptive codes, they don't reveal how a structure performs. About all you know is it didn't fall down, and nobody's complaining, but you really don't know how it performed. You don't know if the design is conservative or unconservative, or by how much. There is inconsistent treatment of reliability. We can't assess damages and associated costs because we can't really predict what they might be. And we can't have informed conversations with the stakeholders. We either met the code or we didn't meet the code. And that's about as much as we can say when we have conversations with the stakeholders. And of course, we generally don't address non-structural performance as a function of structural response. But we can tie in if we're doing performance-based design. So our present codes are prescriptive. They dictate how we and what we do through formulas for loads, formulas for strengths. It focuses on element performance over system performance. We get lots of instruction about how we do our analyses and what our limits are, and we have an inconsistent treatment of risk. So prescriptive codes don't address all conditions. They stifle creativity. They focus on life safety, which of course is a good thing. And they relegate the engineer to a technician's role. At least that's where we're headed. In contrast, performance-based codes allow flexibility, encourage creativity, can help us address sustainability, resilience, and robustness. We can have improved designs where we can demonstrate reliability, and we elevate the role of the engineer. So prescriptive codes give us the path with little acknowledgement of objectives and verification of performance, whereas performance-based approaches state the objectives up front and let the path be defined by the engineer. So performance-based codes will liberate structural engineers to solve presently unsolvable problems. Linking back to that statement that was in the case for change report that I put up on an early slide. So what has to happen? How do we transform the profession to get to where we need to be across the board? Well, there are many things that we have to do in the process. We have to have a shift in mindset. We have to understand that we can do things differently. We have to agree on when it's appropriate to use performance-based design. It likely is not for all designs. You don't need this for a routine structure, a two-story office building with rectangular grids, 4-column patterns. We don't need it for that. So we have to decide when it's appropriate, and maybe there'll be alternatives for either applying it or not if it comes into the code. It does require a significant restructuring of the codes and new training and skills. Most engineers today, I suspect, feel threatened by this and maybe feel their skills are inadequate to pursue it, and that's okay. Training will solve those issues, and we need acceptance by the stakeholders. Everybody needs to understand that there will be benefits in performance. And everybody needs to understand that there will be value to performing the effort necessary to get to the design if we're following performance-based approaches. We have to establish what is the workable framework, what should be in the code. And if we are developing codes now that will be performance-based, what do we need to know that we don't know now? And how will we get to where that knowledge is understood and can be expressed so that engineers can use it? So there'll be work to do in some areas. And then how do we need to change the education, both for practicing engineers as this rolls out and back in the formal education stage? What should engineers in school be taught so that they will be better prepared to operate in the future of structural engineers? And this isn't just the future as expressed by performance-based codes. It includes other types of features that are going to be impacting our life on a daily basis. And along with the code itself, what do we need to develop and provide, because we are not expressing everything in the code. We're leaving it to the engineer to develop the path. There need to be resources for the engineer to do that. And it should be perhaps through some deemed to comply provisions. Again, it may not be necessary for performance-based codes to be applied to all structures. In fact, it probably will not. So there may be some deemed to comply provisions. We'll need to have references that are well understood, well vetted, so that we know they're reliable. And there will need to be some how-to guides so that people who are entering this arena will have some understanding about how to apply the tools that they need and they have to perform the proper designs. So we need to develop the curriculum, develop the standards, and implement both, including educating us into how this process works. The benefit or the outcome, what will we have when we get there? Presumably the codes will be shorter. They will directly assess performance for the agreed circumstances. They'll be supported by robust guidance. They will liberate engineers to be creative and allow us to better serve our clients and society. What's the time frame for all this? Well, I suppose it could be decades. It may be a generation before we are wholly tuned into performance-based codes, but it's something we need to do, and it's something that we will certainly see value from when we are finished. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Welcome back. Many of you have already put in great questions, but we welcome more. Keep going into that chat box as we go along. Don, welcome. The first question for you is, do you see performance-based design completely replacing prescriptive design, or will our future be alternative choices between performance and prescriptive?
Oh, I fully expect that there'll be choices. It would not be, in many cases, it wouldn't make sense to be designing a very routine structure following potentially complicated procedures. We could have prescriptive designs for routine, relatively simple structures. I would expect that performance-based engineering would be applied to iconic structures and unusual structures, large buildings. It already is to some extent. And perhaps for routine structures, there could be alternatives, deemed to comply solutions that would satisfy the need without going through the processes that are associated with performance-based design. So I arrangement eventually.
Okay, thank you. Related question is, how will performance-based design affect our existing codes and standards like ASCE 7 or the International Building Code?
I would expect that they will change substantially. I can imagine certainly that they would be shorter. I would expect our codes and our standards, like those which we refer to at first order right now, would be establishing things, expectations, and hazard scenarios that would get mapped to each other. Probably in the place of the detailed information that you find in documents like that now would be guidance documents, where an engineer could look for the relevant information that they would be using to satisfy a performance-based approach. So I would expect these codes to be shorter and dealing with the overall issues that a designer needs to consider, not the minutia, but that parallel similar documents would still be available to designers.
Okay. Don, your voice is coming through a little broken on my screen. I wonder if this is a general problem. Can the systems folks have a look and let me know if we need to make some correction here? Are we good? Okay, we're okay. So, Don, the next question relates to education. How do you see performance-based design impacting undergraduate education?
Well, there are several things that I think that would be important for engineers of the future operating in this area to strengthen from what we have now. First of all, I think that intuition into the performance of a structure is going to be key. And I think Alistair spoke to that earlier in one of the presentations earlier this afternoon. But at any rate, I think we need to have a clear understanding about how buildings perform rather than simply following the calculations that lead to a validation of a particular element's performance. We'll be more interested in understanding the system than the element, probably, by comparison to the way we do it now. We'll have to have a better understanding for the basis of loads. Right now, we go to a code and it tells us how much snow load to design for on a roof. But when we're talking about return periods and probabilities of certain conditions existing, we'll need to have a better understanding of the bases and determining those things if we care to do it on our own. But I think one of the real major changes that I think is going to happen is that we're going to have to improve our abilities to communicate, because we will be talking with the stakeholders about their goals, their expectations, and either understanding them so that we can take it into our design, but more importantly, explaining to them at the end what the design is going to do for them under certain circumstances. And we're going to have a bigger role, I think, in the construction sphere, working with all of the stakeholders. So I think communication is a skill that engineers will have to improve in the future.
And that is something that's talked about quite a bit in the SEI vision for the future, isn't it? You can see the interconnection between these various parts about where we need to go.
For sure.
Thank you. I have a series of questions to walk you through that really relate to the legality and the adoption of performance-based design and the challenge. Let's start with legal. We touched a little bit on codes, but what are the challenges from making performance-based design legal in various jurisdictions, from a code standpoint?
Well, I think the first thing that has to happen is there has to be an education among the stakeholder groups about what performance-based codes are, what performance-based engineering is, how each stakeholder will benefit, and how they will interact in the process. There is comfort, and we have adopted it in following the code and knowing that if we do that, we have fulfilled the minimum standard. We have a design that should be safe. But I think that as we get into performance-based, we'll need to develop a bit of a comfort level that it is an execution of a design and engineering process. Often, certainly on major structures, there will be a peer review step in the process to add comfort to the quality of the outcome. Mm-hmm. So I think education about these things first is going to be key, so that the stakeholders, all of them from the owner to the building official, everybody in between, and the contractor even, has an understanding about what we're all doing together and why it's beneficial for all parties. I think bringing it in as the formal way that design is performed may be a process that takes decades, maybe a generation or two to come in before everybody is comfortable with it and it becomes the primary step. So I think it's a process that everybody will need to become comfortable with over the period of time.
So we know we've made some very good progress in the area of seismic design in the U.S. And some with fire engineering. What lessons have we learned from that about how to go about communicating with the key stakeholders? Yeah,
I think in those areas there has been progress, clearly, because there is a lot of seismic design that is done, and in particular upgrading of structures that is done on a performance-based engineering approach. And I think that the stakeholders who are benefiting from that approach recognize the values, and they have adopted the comfort level that they need to operate there. Fire is new. Fire is now under discussion. There is the appendix in ASCE 7 and the guidance document that goes along with it, explaining more about how to perform an analysis for fire. So we're learning there. We don't have a good track record yet, but I'm hopeful that we will be convincing stakeholders of the value and the benefits. If nothing else, we now will better understand how structures will perform in fire. And if that is something that people are become comfortable with, it'll follow. We'll learn our lessons and we'll advance.
Great. Along that line, I have one question here that was submitted regarding the cost of performance-based design. The presumption in the question, as I read it, is that PVD will be more expensive to execute in the design process, maybe impact the schedule. How do we make it affordable, or how do we persuade clients if it's more expensive?
Yeah. You have to know that if you're going to actually do an analysis, it's going to be more expensive than something that is automated. I mean, that's fine. That's a given. But I think the value argument comes through the performance of the structure and our confidence in our understanding of the performance of the structure. The engineering may cost more, but the owner, the purchaser, will get a better structure. Certainly something that is potentially cheaper because the design has been refined. It's not forced by a prescriptive set of provisions. And in the bottom line, yes, it may be that we'll have to allow time in the schedule, and we'll have to allow a fee to the designer. Mm-hmm. But the expectation is ultimately that the purchaser will have a better structure, potentially more cost effective.
Very good. One of our submitters, viewers, suggests that prescriptive design is perhaps a better safeguard against poor engineering. How do you respond to that?
And that's interesting. Yeah. It could easily be, because we will be thinking about what we're doing. We're not just rote following provisions in a code. We will be thinking about it. We will be testing our outcomes both numerically and intellectually. And if we have a peer review process in this, a legitimate, well-performed peer review process, we're having a second set of qualified eyes outside of the firm that's generating the design in the first place to take a close look. I think there's a real possibility, probability, that we will be able to have much higher confidence in our designs.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The other question relates to computer analyses and reminds us of some of the Q&A we had during the cross session about over-reliance on high-end analysis and so forth. And the question really relates to the question of, does performance-based design require more extensive, more sophisticated analyses for which there may be more ways to go wrong? And are there risks associated with that?
Well, I think the answer to that, I think, is that we will always be doing sophisticated analyses. We're certainly doing more sophisticated analyses now than we did 15, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that the level of sophistication will be a function of the sophistication of the software that we have. I think what will be different is that we will be looking at systems more than elements, meaning how does the whole structural system perform, more so than how a particular element performs. There certainly will be thresholds that we will not put more demand on an element than it requires. But the sophistication will be offset, I think, by the intuition that we will apply and the quality checks that we will perform, much as was talked about in the cross presentation earlier on. So, I consider this to be a plus. Mm-hmm. I mean, I want to use my brain. I want to be challenged. And I think the profession should desire for a way to express our intellect and to do it in a way that results in quality, reliable designs. So I think it's a plus that we will be doing more sophisticated analyses.
Good. I think we have time for one more question. I suspect there might be a couple of components to your answer, so I'm leaving a little time for that. But what, from your perspective, are the largest challenges to adopting performance-based design as we move forward? We've talked about some of them, but other thoughts?
Well, I think one of the big challenges will be overcoming our own hesitation to go a new way. Mm-hmm. We have, we're a pretty risk-averse profession. and we're set in our ways, and we've all learned from our mentors who preceded us. And to break a path, a new path, is going to be a challenge for us. Do we really want to do this, or are we just too comfortable doing what we're doing now? If we can get by that, then the next effort, of course, is to challenge the stakeholders to come along with us. The purchasers and the architects and everybody, the building officials all along the way. That clearly is another important step. And then, of course, developing the appropriate documents that properly lay out the requirements that ought to be in a code, and the appropriate documents to provide guidance to the engineer about how to comply. And along with that is the education. Our young engineers in school and those entering the profession will be developing new skills that those of us who are later in our profession don't presently have. We also will have to pick up those to the extent that we are still in practice when this hits the ground as the common way to design buildings. So these are all obstacles, none of them insurmountable. They're mostly momentum and definition and then implementation.
Fantastic, Don. Thank you very much. And viewers, there you have it. Don is laying down a challenge for us all to improve ourselves and the way we go about our work in this inspiring vision for the future of structural engineering. Thanks very much, Don.
Okay, thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce SEI Awards Chair, Dr. Jerry Hajar. Jerry is a member of the SEI Board of Directors and is CDM Smith Professor and Department Chair, Civil and Environmental Engineering at Northeastern University. Jerry has a brief announcement about this year's awards.
Thank you, Glenn. Honoring those who've made significant contributions to the structural engineering profession is one of the highlights of the year. Individuals are nominated by their peers for achievements in publishing outstanding papers, dedication to technical excellence, and by providing exemplary service and leadership to ASCE and SEI. Once again, we have an impressive group of ASCE and SEI award winners. Congratulations to each of them, and thank you for your excellent service. After this session, please take the opportunity to view the awards recognition program and video linked from asce.org/SEI.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm proud to recognize 13 SEI members shown on this slide who advanced to SEI Fellow this year. The SEI Fellow grade of membership recognizes distinguished SEI members as leaders and mentors in our profession. If you feel you're a prospective SEI Fellow, please consider applying to advance from SEI member grade. Congratulations to the 2020 class of SEI Fellows. And next, a few announcements and reminders. The highlight of Structures Congress for many student and young professional participants is the Meet the Leaders Breakfast, which gives them the opportunity to mix with industry leaders and hear their career insights. I'm pleased to announce that we'll carry forward this opportunity virtually on April 14th through 17th with a pilot on ASCE Collaborate Integrated Buildings and Structures Forum. We'll start with ASCE board member and SEI past president David O'Day and ASCE 7 Wind Load Subcommittee Vice Chair Sherilyn Henry. They'll host a discussion online. This requires SEI ASCE membership. If you're a student and want to participate, remember that SEI and ASCE membership is free to you, so please join to access this program. I encourage all SEI ASCE members to take advantage of both the Structures Congress online community and the Integrated Buildings and Structures Forum on ASCE Collaborate. Connect virtually to reach out to your peers on discussion questions. Access to Structures Congress 2020 proceedings is free via ascelibrary.org through September. And remember to take advantage of your member benefit, 10 ASCE free PDHs. I invite you to read the 2019 SEI Annual Report, Advancing the Vision for the Future of Structural Engineering, at asce.org/SEI. Get involved with SEI. Contact me or Laura anytime with any questions. To wrap up our program today, I'd like to introduce SEI President-elect Joe DePompeo, President of Structural Workshop in New Jersey. Joe's going to be a great SEI president next year.
Thank you, Glenn. I hope you enjoyed the program today. While disappointed that we couldn't have Structures Congress this year, we're happy to have been able to have this virtual event. Stay tuned for more opportunities to engage while many of us are working remotely. We are giving away a $100 Amazon gift card. Please take a few minutes to complete the brief exit survey for a chance to win it. I am hopeful that I will see all of you in person next year at Structures Congress, March 10th to 13th in Seattle, Washington, where we'll be celebrating 25 years of SEI. Be a part of the program. Submit your abstract or session proposal by June 3rd. Stay safe. I wish you and yours a healthy spring season and all of us a quick return to normal.